And now, the moment you've all been waiting for, world discussion with Agent Smith.
Hey, how you doing?
Solid. How are you?
I'm doing all right. Can't complain.
Well, maybe we could help you complain.
Have you had a good week?
Yeah, it's been reasonably good. I was going hard on the hours online. Most of the days during the week I was online for something around 11 hours. And that's kind of a way to get the momentum back after having some time off. We say in the streaming industry, there's no such thing as paid vacation for a streamer. You just retire and then come out of retirement when you're done with your vacation.
Wow, that must have been exhausting.
Yeah, it used to be what I was doing all the time when we were living with Kukyo. I would basically just stream until I couldn't do it anymore, which was around 14 to 16 hours, and then I would sleep until I was done sleeping. So I wasn't quite as constrained by the 24-hour rhythm.
Yeah.
Which I think was good for building up the following and whatnot, but now that we have a more kind of diverse product with the YouTube channel and lots of different kind of coaching stuff, 8 hours is a good amount where I have high energy pretty much the whole time. My energy really slows down past 10 hours. Like the speed at which I'm coming up with jokes and reading chat and playing well and all that. But I think some people appreciate just a chill place to hang out too.
Yeah, that's good. That's a contribution.
Yeah. So there's been a shitload of stuff that has happened this week. I haven't even been seeking out that much news, but I've seen some big shit go through. So the biggest point of the week, at least for something that was interesting to me that I would like to know more about, is the Mueller investigation and the 13 Russians. That seemed like... It's not even a joke that it's dank memes. It actually was. They memed the shit out of us. And it worked. And it's kind of continued to work. For people who don't know, at least this is my interpretation, you can correct me if I'm wrong, there were 13 Russian, you could call them agents, who were over here in the US. They had a budget, and they created a bunch of online accounts and personas to kind of disrupt American political discourse online. So Facebook, Reddit, Twitter, all these different social media platforms, they were feeding us a bunch of information to kind of get us angry at each other and to create that kind of division. And I heard that this was because of the sanctions we put on them and kind of a way they can swing back at us. And one of their primary efforts was to make sure that Hillary didn't get elected. But that's basically all I know about it.
Well, that's pretty accurate. It's pretty much just old school Russian agitprop operations. It's the sort of thing they do everywhere pretty consistently. This is more new just because it's online. And, you know, the national security apparatus here in the US doesn't really know quite how to handle the internet and the implications of the internet for national security, for espionage, for politics, for things like that. And so they, being a very risk-averse institution, they tend to freak out a bit with new things like that. And their response to espionage on the internet, which is basically what this is, has been very aggressive. They see it as a kind of warfare. You know, the whole cyberspace and operations on the cyberspace. Their perspective of that is very hostile. They see it as more an extension of their realm in the normal space on land, air, sea, etc. And they wish that the government would give them more power to crack down on it, or at least take more initiative to counter what they perceive as aggressive foreign operations in the United States. I would note, and I think it's important to note, that I think it was the FBI stated that while they did find that these 12 people were guilty of propagating this operation, they also stated that they did not think that it impacted the election. And so that, I think, is also an important consideration. I don't think this is quite the Russians stealing an election or the sky is falling, American political culture or democracy is in peril. I think it is an important issue. I think it is significant that presumably the Russian state or at least some Russian actors of some kind, are trying to disrupt American elections and conducting agitprop. But I wouldn't go so far as to say it's an inherent significant threat to the nation. It is not a national security threat per se, in my opinion. Obviously that's subjective, so everybody kind of has to make their own judgment on that, but
Well,
I would not take it that far.
I think the statement it did not influence the election is kind of muddy to say in general, because even if it swung one person's vote, it influenced the election. Maybe not the outcome of the election, but the overall discourse leading up to it and the current American attitude politically. It seems like there's no question that it has changed the way a lot of people are talking about American politics, even if it's not like these people are now pulling the strings. Like, yeah, we could say we doubt that they've totally hijacked our country. They memed the shit out of us. They probably got some people riled up. One thing that kind of made me take pause when the results came out and it turned out to be these Russian agents was it seemed like both sides were kind of hoping that it was the other political party. So the Democrats were hoping that this was something that all the Republicans were in on, and then Trump is going to get kicked out. And the flip side is the opposite side thought that maybe they'll get kicked out too. So it really accomplished the objective, I think, of increasing the divisive nature of discourse in our country. Maybe it didn't, like, derail us entirely, but there have been so many...
contributed.
Yeah, there have been so many posts about how polarized our political discourse is right now, and it seems like that certainly didn't help us.
Yeah. Yeah, the degree to which it exacerbated existing tensions is debatable, and that would take more research than I'm aware of. I would have to read a lot more about that. Mm-hmm. But, yeah, certainly it did not help, and they went out of their way to try to misrepresent both sides of the political spectrum in the United States to try and facilitate agitation on both left and right. As was, Trump won, and so that's kind of gotten more attention since it's the left that's been more upset about that and tried to find an answer and kind of partly tried to blame Russian operations, such as they are, for that. But the left also had its misrepresentations. These operations did also seek to support the Bernie Sanders campaign, if I remember correctly. And that failed in the primaries. And so Russian support for that side of American politics did not get as much attention after the fact.
Yeah, one of the things that I read as a key point was it wasn't so much that they were trying to get Trump to win as they were trying to make sure Hillary did not win. That was kind of the most important thing. And maybe you know some about her history as Secretary of, was she Defense or State?
She was Sec State.
Okay. Yeah, so maybe the way that she acted in that role toward Russia influenced their effort on trying to make sure that she didn't get the president job.
Yeah, I don't think it was anything in particular she did or said as Secretary of State. It was more just sort of her conventional insider politics, her sort of establishment politician platform, which in general is sort of more forward in American foreign policy. Whether left or right, in general there had been a consensus in U.S. politics that it was good and desirable and beneficial for the United States to have a proactive role in the world of some kind. Obviously, there was some difference as to how aggressive or where interventions or influence should be exerted. But in general, there was a consensus that American presence in the world and activity was beneficial for the national interest. And for the Russians, that sort of translated to a anti-Russian policy as they perceive it, supporting the European Union and European Union expansion, sort of toying with the idea of NATO expansion in Georgia and the Ukraine. These were sort of seen as being aggressive to Russia's national interest. And so the Russians in turn seeing that as an implicit threat, if not explicit competition for territory, responded basically as much as they could. They can't do anything too explicit. As has been discussed before, Russia's military, economic, and political power is much more limited than it was when it was the Soviet Union. And so they can't really afford a direct competition, a direct explicit competition with the United States. So as disruptive as agitprop in Western politics has been, and the Russian agitprop specifically in the West has been, that's still represents them pulling their punches. They could do more, but they see this as a maybe not risk-free way of pursuing Russia's interest in trying to suppress Western impulses as far as promoting democracy, promoting free market competition, and promoting expansion of liberal ideas and institutions outside of the West. They see it as a way of constraining those forces without putting Russia in great risk. It's not riskless, but it's much less risk than if they were, say, to launch an invasion or to use sanctions or something to that effect. Obviously, some of that did happen eventually with the Ukraine crisis, but they would have preferred otherwise. They tried to limit their intervention to avoid those things. And it's been a source of some aggravation, if not some regret, that that ended up happening anyway. So the Russian foreign policy since then has mostly been focused on unwinding those sanctions and unwinding those tensions that arose because of the Ukrainian intervention, and returning Western Russian relations to that pre-Ukraine state when they were not quite particularly friendly, but were not hostile either. So it's more just Hillary Clinton in general as a symbol of status quo American foreign policy, and that sort of implicit anti-Russian bias that Moscow perceived in that status quo. That's more why they were opposing Hillary Clinton's candidacy. That's my understanding of it anyway.
Yeah, but we talked about that whenever she was running and kind of how she was the status quo candidate. Of everyone running, she was kind of promising to change the least. She was like, we're going to be Obama plus, yay! Which didn't really seem to fit what Americans wanted overall.
Yeah. Yeah, they, you know, the primaries were sort of indicative of that. There was, of course, the big insurgency by the Sanders campaign on the left, and then the Trump campaign on the right. And the Russians were, of course, quite pleased with that, because that gave them a vector through which agitprop operations could be uniquely effective. And they took advantage of that. I think, though, they were probably as surprised as anybody when Trump actually won the primary, and also just as surprised when he eventually won the presidency. The expectations inside the United States and outside the United States was that Hillary Clinton would win. Russian agitprop operations were probably more intended just to create as much tension as possible rather than facilitate a particular outcome.
Yeah.
And as we've seen since Trump has become president, their relations between Russia and the United States have not particularly improved. In fact, the fact that Russia did engage in those operations, allegedly, in those agitprop operations, and their linkage to the Trump campaign have served to kind of sabotage any potential improvement there might have been. So that kind of serves as evidence that that probably wasn't the long-term objective that they wanted. What else happened this week? I don't really quite remember.
The Florida shooting.
Oh, that's pretty standard at this point. We get one of those every couple of months or so.
Yeah. For some reason, this one seemed to have maybe stood out a little bit more. I think part of it is a lot of the students involved have a pretty involved, like, social media presence. So that's one thing that's kind of evolving moving forward, is as these tragedies are happening, more and more of these people have more and more of a voice about what's going on, as opposed to them falling by the wayside. And one of the things that I've noticed is you can almost see a trend of these shootings, like that it's something that certain people see as a way to get a lot of attention and make something really big happen. I mean, it's obviously terrible, but if they feel like they're not getting the life that they want, or they're not getting noticed as they want to be noticed by the world, then that's a way for them to fuck some shit up. But it seems like it's basically the gun lobby is trying to make sure that there aren't big changes with the way that people can get guns and whatnot. It's pretty ridiculous seeing the difference between gun violence and deaths in the United States compared to other developed nations. It's like, what are we doing?
Yeah, that's they were very the kids involved in the incident were very proactive pretty quick after. You know, they were pretty quick to jump in there and surprisingly well organized. You know, they made a pretty strong effort and have tried to make some kind of movement, some kind of campaign online with objectives and a petition and etc. And it's a little better organized than the usual sort of hashtag movement that generally pops up after these kinds of things. So that's to their credit. And I think that's kind of why that feels different, so to speak. But I don't think they're going to make any traction. I don't think there will be any substantive change this time around any more than any of the previous times. The fundamental political calculus remains unchanged. There's still a significant block of people in the United States that is not interested in that, is not interested in significant gun control reform. Maybe some is possible. You know, I would think that at least mild reform would be possible, but it may be that it's so politicized that even that isn't possible at this point.
Well, one of the silly things about it, when I'm kind of looking at the situations, and some diagrams have been posted of like these shootings, most times they're using AR-15s, which are assault rifles, and it kind of raises the question of how are these kids getting assault rifles? And then you kind of find out this is the United States. It's very easy to get an assault rifle.
Yeah.
I think it's even easier to get a assault rifle than a pistol, which is amazing. Just kind of how the laws end up working out. It's not really something that makes that much sense. But you have those kind of moments of destruction where someone wants to lash out and fuck some stuff up, and the extent of the damage they can do is relative to the weapon they can obtain. And we have the best weapons. It's actually part of the issue, I think, in the U.S.
Yeah, there's an immense arms industry in the United States, and there are a number of loopholes in the laws regarding background checks, gun shows being the preeminent example. The gun show issue kind of varies by state, since I think some states actually do have laws specifically targeting gun shows, but in states like Texas, for example, private sale background checks for weapon sales do not apply to private transactions at, say, a gun show. So it is quite possible to build up a very large armory without background checks, if you are so inclined, such is the way the law is written. If, as I understand it, you know, if I'm getting that wrong, someone in chat, please do correct me. I welcome criticism and feedback in chat, so please do participate in that regard if you're listening. Yeah, that some of it comes down to urban-rural divide, because a lot of rural culture and rural politics is much more comfortable with guns, and doesn't have as much of an issue with guns. These shootings generally happen in urban or suburban areas. Very rarely do I think do they happen in rural areas. So for rural voters and political actors, this isn't really a problem for them, and they see an attempt to impose gun control as an assault on their culture and way of life. In contrast, if you live in an urban area, then you feel that their way of life, so to speak, and their political preferences are being imposed on you. You know, if you live in an urban area, gun control makes more sense to you, or at least to a lot of people here. Obviously, there's a lot of people in urban areas that are pro-gun control. I think Kukio was one of them, if I recall. So there is this kind of clash of urban versus rural culture here in the United States, and that's not easily resolved. And the NRA is partly a manifestation of that. A lot of their support probably comes from rural areas or people living in urban areas with a rural background. And a lot of those people are kind of the mind that it's better to have guns, even if there is a cost because of the perceived benefit or because of tradition or what have you. There is something beyond the raw statistics of gun violence that is important to their calculation there. Their political preference is in part informed by their own experience and background rather than by what policy would objectively decrease gun violence or what policy would improve performance in that regard, or what would make the United States look more like peer nations in terms of gun violence. I think that is an important part of the discussion, but I think that's only part of it for that side of the debate. It may be that if you just have a fully informed debate about this subject, because I think part of the reason people get frustrated is because they think people on the other side of the debate are not fully informed about guns, gun control, etc., the statistics. It may be that if you did have a fully informed debate on both sides, you could still end up with an anti-gun control outcome, just because those other preferences are superseding the preference for significantly lower gun violence. And I don't think it's editorializing to say that more gun control would facilitate less gun violence overall. Gun violence is a very broad category that includes, gang violence, suicides, accidents, etc. So if you had more gun control, it's probably, and I don't think it would be controversial to say that overall levels of gun deaths would fall, at least somewhat. Mm-hmm. So I think if you did have that debate and it were fully realized, then it would still be quite possible that people would still prefer less gun control, and that they would be willing to trade some gun violence and security in exchange for the right and freedom to own firearms. And that calculus, again, hasn't really changed. I don't think this incident, any more than previous incidents, or anything that the pro-gun control side of the debate has done politically to try to push for more gun control, addresses that fact or is going to change it. Mm-hmm. And hence my prediction that there probably won't be any further change, in spite of the better organized effort being made by the victims of the latest shooting in Florida.
One of the things that, from my brain science perspective, is a little bit frustrating to see is a lot of people will either kind of rally against the use of guns, or they'll say, oh, this person is crazy, we need better mental care. But it seems like because these people are shouting about a different thing, neither of them gets done, which is kind of annoying. We kind of have the two sides that point to a different cause for what caused this to happen, and then since they disagree on the cause, then neither of them gets adjusted at all. It's like, okay.
Yeah, that's kind of the way American political discourse has evolved. Even something as basic as the cause of an issue becomes politicized. If you assert something like, say, more gun control would lead to less gun violence, even stating that can be perceived as politically controversial because it's associated with the starting point for the opposition's debate, for their argument. And so people just sort of tune you out because they assume that, you're just a partisan, you're just pushing an agenda instead of trying to reach some kind of objective conclusion, instead of trying to conduct some kind of analysis to understand, the overarching dynamics of the issue beyond any subjective partisan perspective. And that's hard to deal with because a lot of people get hung up on that. They would rather fight the political battle than they would to try to make some kind of compromise and find the common ground. And there's no easy solution to that. That ties into the other talks we've had about political culture and political norms and understanding the need for compromise in a liberal democracy and having a political culture that facilitates that kind of compromise. That's kind of on the wane in the United States, unfortunately, and nobody has any good ideas about how to reverse that. And so this is kind of a manifestation of that difficulty.
One thing that's kind of a fun fact related to this is that people with mental illness are most likely to injure themselves before they injure someone else. So that defense, sometimes it's true, but I think people use it more often than it's actually the case. They'd be like, oh, this is a crazy child who shot up his school. Usually it's just someone who's really fucked up, and they're functioning properly, like they don't really have anything that is directly impacting their ability to perform or do their daily tasks and stuff. They just have a really nasty kind of worldview and perspective that makes them feel like shooting up a school is a good idea, which there should be an effort to kind of counter that as well, not just, oh, it's sick people who are doing this. I mean, it can just be people who are evil. How do we adjust that? And then, like you're saying, it's the norms. The norms have to change of what is an acceptable way to think about the world and be a kid and how to manage your anger and emotions and whatnot. People can be pretty upset about their station in life and what's going on in the world and stuff. How do you deal with that? If people don't know, oftentimes they'll do something that's really bad.
Yeah, and part of the trouble there is that debates about mental health kind of get bogged down in statist versus non-state solutions, arguments about that, which is a very frequent pattern seen in American political arguments. The ACLU, for example, is more opposed to certain mental health initiatives. For example, I remember a few years ago, one of the proposals was to take people who were on the terrorist watch list maintained by the FBI and put them on a blacklist of people who could not buy firearms. And the ACLU, among other people, opposed that, predicated mostly on their long-running opposition to the terrorist watch list in the first place. Because watch lists tend to be somewhat arbitrary, it's very easy to end up on one inadvertently, basically by accident. You know, names get mixed up, or people end up on them based on very limited, meager evidence. And you know, if that is the case, it's also very difficult to get off the watch list if you have been put on there mistakenly or frivolously. And so, based on that, the ACLU opposed their use for the gun issue, as well as for broader counterterrorism issues. And so, that's an example of a mental health sort of policy proposal kind of getting mired in the overarching debate about how large should the government be and how intrusive should state measures be when it comes to policy in general, but security in particular. Security in particular being a somewhat emotive subject for a lot of people.
It's interesting thinking about a lot of these attributes that we consider to be American, like personal liberty, and how a lot of the issues will kind of get connected to one of those American attitudes. So it's acceptable to refuse to compromise with the other party because you can't agree on one particular detail, as opposed to kind of praising someone's ability to be flexible and to like strike those compromises where you can, so that you make some progress overall, even if it's not precisely the way you may have wanted it. It's something that on average is going to benefit people more than it hurts them.
Yeah, American notions of freedom tend to heavily emphasize personal freedom, which is a little bit different in Europe. And in Europe, it's more freedom from poverty, freedom from this, that, or the other. In the United States, the emphasis is more the freedom to do things, the freedom to start your own business, the freedom to own guns, the freedom to do this, the other, the other. And that's kind of a libertarian political cultural trait here in the United States that has deep roots. It's a little bit weaker on the East Coast and the West Coast, but tends to be stronger, again, in the rural areas, which goes back to that rural-urban divide that pops up a lot.
There was a lecture recently, I think it's from University of Stanford, in the philosophy subreddit, that talked about the history of people kind of evaluating what freedom is as a concept, because a lot of those foundational issues aren't even agreed upon by your average citizen, which makes it even harder to kind of figure out what the people should do, what legislators should do, if the people don't even know what freedom is. People use a lot of the buzzwords without thinking about what does this word actually entail for me and my ability to act or not act in this country.
Yeah.
Maybe someone can link that would be helpful.
Yeah, that's an important question, and it's exactly because important concepts like that are ambiguous that you need an open society, because if you have an open society, issues like that can be hashed out in public. There can be some kind of debate and then eventually some kind of consensus on what an acceptable definition would be that could then inform policy decision making after the fact. We haven't really been able to kind of get past that debate stage, and so as a result we're sort of stuck in gear, unable to reach compromise, unable to reach broader understanding and construction for policies that might address some of these social ills, social issues, political issues, what have you. So let me see. We did have some questions. Looks like I'd like to know the amount of influence that international institutions like the UN or international legislation like the UDHR have, and how it would be possible to make them more relevant. Thanks for the answer. So international institutions like the UN, not just the UN. It kind of depends on the institution and what its mission is. So the UN was kind of meant to be more of a common ground through which great powers could meet and settle differences. The idea at the inception of the UN was that great powers would act as the policemen for their respective spheres of influence. And whatever tensions may have emerged on the borders of those spheres of influence, that was more what the UN was meant to kind of deal with. The UN was also kind of meant to be a collective defense organization in which any particular problem country or area could be dealt with collectively by the rest of the world, rather than just by the countries in the area concerned. That, of course, didn't quite work out as planned. Two of the world's policemen, as were envisioned at the time, China and Russia, didn't quite pan out the way people had hoped. You know, China, of course, kind of collapsed and was taken over by the communists, by the Communist Party of China specifically, and then the Soviet Union was perceived as an unreliable partner at the time, because of tensions that evolved sort of out of the end of World War II. And so the UN, as a result, kind of became a little bit dysfunctional. It still served its purpose as just a common ground, just a place to kind of debate international issues. But because there was that lack of sort of equal and there was a lack of mutual understanding between the great powers, the original function was somewhat lost. So the UN kind of defaulted to its secondary function as basically a talking shop. It does do some useful things. There are useful international missions, etc. But for the most part, it doesn't really solve international issues like it had originally been hoped. But that said, I don't think it's entirely fair to criticize it for not being able to solve those issues, because it was never meant to solve those issues by itself. It was just meant to make it easier for great powers to coordinate the solution between themselves. If the great powers did not want to solve those issues, then the UN would not be able to do it for them, and was never intended to. So I don't think the UN by itself has a lot of influence, nor do I think it was ever intended to have a lot of influence. But, on the other hand, there are institutions like, say, the World Bank, which have somewhat more influence. If you're a country that is desperate for development money, the World Bank has some influence over you. It used to require a lot of economic restructuring back in the day, some of which was not particularly helpful. It's backed off of that since then, but in general, the policy requirements and requests by the World Bank serve to have a fair amount of influence amongst countries that wish to receive money from it. The IMF is another example, although that's kind of more of a mixed bag, because the IMF was originally meant to be a kind of stabilizer for the Bretton Woods Agreement and that system of international foreign exchange rates that had been envisioned at Bretton Woods. Once that collapsed, the IMF kind of lost its raison d'etre, and after that it sort of defaulted to a new purpose, which was to kind of stabilize crises, just in financial crises in general. And because they generally were only approached by countries in crisis, they had a lot of leverage over those countries, and that leverage gave them a lot of power. They used that again to generally request economic restructuring, generally in the form of liberalizing measures. But the point is, a fair amount of influence there, which is one of the reasons China wants to get more influence on it. So I would say how much power an international institution has depends on its mission, what it wants to do, how narrow it is. The UN has a very broad mission and not a lot of institutional power with which to pursue it. Whereas in contrast, the World Bank and the IMF have a much narrower mission and much more resources with which to pursue that mission. And how would it be possible to make them more relevant? It would be easy to make them more relevant. The quick and easy way would be to give those institutions supranational power, which is a fancy word that means to give them legal power over states. Kind of like the European Union has certain powers that supersede the laws and decisions of the states that are a member of the EU. The trouble with supranational powers like that is that they tend to be very unpopular. Nations don't like to give up sovereignty. And so there's generally a lot of resistance to empowering international institutions in that way. Generally, nations and governments want institutions like that to be designed more on a cooperative basis, and especially on a volunteer basis, which of course limits the power of the institution. It could also be effective to design institutions to be sort of smaller and more focused, such that they can be more impactful in their narrow area of responsibility. But even there, the problem you would have would be states resisting interference from that institution. So really, the question is not how do you make these institutions more powerful. The real overarching question that would facilitate that is how do you get states to be more cooperative? How do you get, especially major powers, to recognize common interests and to be willing to sacrifice some sovereignty in order to pursue those common interests? That would require a lessening of tensions between great powers and a more cooperative international political culture in general. And that, of course, is a very difficult thing to do. It would be very ideal if that could be reached somehow, but getting from point A to point B is the tricky bit, and nobody's really quite been able to contrive a way to navigate that in any way that is, guaranteed to facilitate the desired outcome there. What's your view on cryptocurrencies, and where do you think they will stand politically in a couple of years?
Wow, this is a new question. We get a lot of repeat questions here. No, that's one we get every single week. Neither of us are crypto experts. It's a bit of a frenzy right now in terms of a lot of people have taken it up as a hobby. We have a person who has been a StarCraft streamer who is now a crypto kind of personality, and that's like what she does. So just to give a kind of perspective on how integrated this is with our existing kind of population of gamers, we have gamers who are now crypto enthusiasts.
Mm-hmm.
Pretty cool.
Yeah, we've been over cryptocurrencies before, so I won't retread a lot of that. I will say that in general, the perspective of economists, which is more my background, is skeptical of cryptocurrencies as a currency. As a commodity, it might be more useful, but as a currency, the advantages are a bit limited in that regard. Now, where do I think it will stand politically in a couple of years? There is kind of growing regulatory pressure on cryptocurrencies. A lot of states like China, Asian states in general, seem to be leading on this to kind of limit trading, if not bar trading in cryptocurrency exchanges. And that stems from concerns with money laundering and fraud, principally. Since there is a number of cryptocurrencies that are basically issued just to get money from the initial offering, and then you just leave it, and it doesn't go anywhere. And so there's been a number of scams in that regard over time. I'll add here again that I'm not as Neuro said, I'm not a crypto guy, so that may not be the best wording or entirely accurate, but that's my understanding of it. But given the regulatory pressure, probably it's going to get a lot more pressure like that, and you'll see a few cryptocurrencies kind of emerge that are able to kind of survive in the new regulatory environment that emerges. That in general is kind of what happens with new industries, so to speak, such as they are, in so much as you can consider cryptocurrency as an industry. Generally, when the industry is new, there's a lot of new entrants, there's a lot of participants, and there's a lot of competition, and it tends to be a little more wild and woolly. And then regulation comes and kind of thins out the herd, in addition to competitive pressures that filter out sort of the weaker participants. And then over time, you end up with a few entrants kind of dominating the market. So, in so much as cryptocurrencies can be considered similar to normal industries, and in so much as you agree that it might replicate that experience, I would expect then that there would be just a handful of cryptocurrencies in the future, and that they're much more stable on account of the better and safer environment that is proffered by new regulations. Again, not a crypto guy, so you're entitled to your opinion on that, and I would welcome criticism from people who are more versed in this field to try to correct me or add to what I've said on that.
We're just here to tell you what we don't know about cryptocurrency.
Yeah. Yeah, I can probably tell you a lot more about what I don't know than I do. Let's see, so how big an impact do district lines have on the vote? Yeah, that's a big question, because that gets into the design of the electoral system. Actually, I'll write that down, electoral. Yeah, we've kind of discussed this before, and I kind of stumbled a bit when I did. So I'll try to be more concise here. I'm assuming this person is American and are talking about the American electoral system. If not, I encourage them to kind of say so, and then we can kind of get into the sort of the broader debate about electoral systems in general. In the United States, we have a first-past-the-post system. And in a first-past-the-post system, you know, majority vote wins, and the vote happens within a geographically designed district. It's specifically cut out of the overarching polity, you know, the state, so to speak, where these votes generally happen on a federal level. States are carved up into different territories, and then people within those territories vote for their representative in the House of Representatives. And thus, the bulk of Congress is elected. Senators are, I believe, statewide votes. So in that case, it's just state. But this also happens at the state level for state offices. Generally, the states are similarly carved up into districts, and those districts elect their representatives, and thus seats are allocated in the state level Congress. So how important are they to the final vote? You can design districts in such a way to encourage a certain outcome. In general, there's a bias that's introduced into Congress at the national level, if not also state Congresses. If you design districts in a way, gerrymandering is what it's called. If you gerrymander your districts, there is a bias towards one party or the other in terms of the allocation of seats in Congress. What is the state equivalent of Congress?
Legislature?
Thank you. Legislature. State legislatures. Kept tripping over the word.
I'm being quizzed.
Yeah, so the tricky thing for me here with this question is that I'm not a political scientist, and I'm not sure exactly the degree of impact that gerrymandering has on different states, if not in general. So I don't know if I can say that gerrymandering completely throws off state legislatures such that they are disproportionately represented by one party over the other. And again, in general, they are disproportionately represented when there is gerrymandering. But whether or not one party has control of a state legislature just because of gerrymandering, I don't know if I can say that. I don't really think so. I would think if that were the case, it would probably be much more of an issue, if not explicitly illegal. And I don't think anybody who gerrymanders really goes that far. I think the issue is not, how can I seize control of the state with gerrymandering? I think the question more is, how can I pick up a couple extra seats with gerrymandering and create districts where there's job security, so to speak, for candidates in my political party? gerrymandered districts generally are not very competitive. Generally, one party dominates in them, and that makes it very easy to get reelected over and over again. And the effects on that the effects of that aspect of gerrymandering on politics is a discussion in and of itself. But my point here is that I'm not familiar enough with the literature corresponding to gerrymandering to know just how damaging gerrymandering is, and just how should I say, disruptive, I guess, gerrymandering is to the proportional distribution of seats in a state legislature. So without that knowledge, I kind of hesitate to say more than that. Because you do ask specifically how big an impact, so I can't really tell you exactly how big an impact. It's worse in some states than others, I can say that much. States like Texas, for example, generally have pretty thoroughly gerrymandered states. I know there are Supreme Court cases for Maryland and Wisconsin, I think, moving through the court system. And so they may well also be particularly bad examples. I think Ohio is kind of better. Generally, Ohio is known for their better governance, so they might not have as much of a problem with that. In so much as that's the case, that's also an example of political culture. In some states, the political culture is such as that people don't really try to gerrymander the states because they recognize that's not really conducive to a constructive environment for legislating. It's not really good politics, so to speak. Whereas in other states, the political culture is such that it's more cutthroat, more competitive. There's more sense that it's more sense of politics as a zero-sum game. In those states, generally, there's more gerrymandering, I think. But I'm sorry, I can't really quite directly answer exactly how big an impact is. Is the United States under the current government moving towards a state of quote-unquote hyper-normalization, as proposed by the filmmaker Adam Curtis when talking about Russia? Hyper-normalization. I haven't seen that. Well, I'm not familiar with the concept, so I can't quite comment directly on it. I am familiar with the argument that in Russia, there's a part of the political culture in Russia that has changed and emerged over the past 10-15 years, has been a sort of institutionalization of gaslighting. And if you're not familiar with the term gaslighting, basically that's creating a lot of doubt and skepticism about sort of what's actually happening in politics, if not wider society in general. That's kind of a long-running Russian cultural thing in Russian politics in general. The Tsars, the Soviets, and then whatever you want to call the Putin regime, the Putinistas, or what have you, so to speak. All of those actors have in general used ambiguity in politics and have strove to inculcate ambiguity and uncertainty in the population in order to make it more difficult for political competition to take place, in order to make it more difficult for people to emerge as leaders of the opposition, and in order for given political issues to turn into ammunition for opposition. That's partly a purposeful effort on the part of an advisor to the Putin government, if not Putin himself. I think his name was Kudrin? I want to say Kudrin. If there are any Russians listening, please correct me on that. I might be getting that wrong. But I believe his name was Kudrin, and he's sort of the political mastermind behind a lot of the Putin government's campaigning and political moves, a lot of their political calculus. He's the same guy that came up with the idea of having opposition, quote-unquote, political parties which are technically loyal to Putin, which doesn't make a lot of sense on the face of it, but it's kind of meant to divert votes from actual opposition parties, the idea being that they're the loyal opposition, whereas sort of these actual opposition parties without links to the Putin government are the disloyal opposition and should not be trusted with the role of opposition party. So nominally, these parties that are supported by the Putin government, which are supposedly opposition parties, will say that they're loyal to Putin and loyal to the government and loyal to Russia also, but that they oppose the government on certain issues or want more to be done on certain other issues. and so count themselves as opposition in that regard. And of course, if they get in power, they don't really do a whole lot. Generally, they kind of have a similar agenda to the United Russia Party, and never really seem to contravene that agenda. Certainly not the agenda of the Putin administration. And the overarching result and the intended goal.
Hang on, dog break. You can keep going. I'm just muting myself.
Oh, okay. Well, the intended goal there is to sap votes from the opposition. And that's been very successful. So that's one of Kudrin's ideas. He kind of drove that, at least as I understand that. And so he's also been behind a lot of the social media campaigning and media in general campaigning, I guess, on the part of the Putin administration, which has served to engender all this ambiguity in Russian politics that makes it difficult to kind of ascertain whether the government is at fault for something or just anything in general. So that kind of environment, it's been postulated as being replicated in the United States, not by the Russian government per se. That's a different issue, but just kind of the general evolution of American politics and political culture. It's been speculated as kind of moving towards a similar environment where different media outlets, different political groups, different politicians are going out of their way to create ambiguity and to make it difficult for any kind of consensus, any kind of bipartisan consensus to be met in terms of recognizing in common what's happening, what a given issue is. It's like what we were talking about earlier with the gun control debate. There's a lot of division about just recognizing root causes of gun violence. And so because everybody has their own pet theory, that makes things difficult. But exacerbating the difficulty is that certain political groups or actors will reach in and sort of distort the debate, distort the issue, distort certain facts and information, if not faking facts and information, just to make it more difficult for their perceived political opponents to gain ground and to fortify their political supporters or like-minded political people of like mind as regard to that given political issue. So in that sense, there's been some of that in the United States, and in so much as that's what this person is asking about, then yeah, I think we are kind of moving towards that as a political norm, unfortunately. And again, that just ties into the overarching hyper-partisanship in the United States that's emerged over the past few decades and has been getting worse, and which is itself sort of a change in the political culture towards being more clannish, towards insular, being more in your bubble, so to speak. The internet has facilitated that with media bubbles. It's quite possible to get stuck in an environment solely of websites and sources of information that confirm your bias, and so make it difficult to break out of that bubble and any false assumptions that your perspective may have and that are encouraged by that bubble. That's a bipartisan thing, not any one side. Yeah, I would agree if that's what you're asking, if that's what he means by hyper-normalization. To counter that, you just have to make people recognize that that's not desirable and that there has to be compromise, and that the only way to get compromise is to try to understand the other side's perspective and to recognize that as a legitimate perspective and their opinions as legitimate opinions, and then to treat them accordingly, treat them as adults, basically, and try to reach a compromise accordingly. How do you get from point A to point B, though? That's hard, because people are very resistant to that notion. There's kind of a sentiment of one true faith, that people's ideology is the one true faith, and that the other people only believe what they believe because they're ignorant or uninformed or etc. And that's not an attitude that is conducive to compromise. So attacking that would probably help, but again, people are so resistant to that it's hard to do. That kind of gets into a whole nother conversation about ideology. That ideology used to mean something else than it means now. It used to be just ideas, but it's become more and more of like a faith, almost. We talked a little bit about that, I think, last episode. Mm-hmm. And, the emergence of ideology as not just kind of a rough theoretical understanding of the world into identity as a part of yourself, that's That's been enormously damaging as far as the political culture. It may be that the political culture can evolve in such a way to incorporate that and still produce desirable outcomes, but we're definitely not there yet. There's a lot of work to be done there.
One thing that kind of stands out to me in just my personal experience is more and more, whenever you're talking about someone, both left and right will oftentimes talk about someone who's on the other side, playing for the other sports team or whatever, and how that's almost something that happens like when people are briefed, oh, we're inviting this person over, and the left will be like, oh, and they're a Trump supporter, or if it's the right, they'll be like, oh, they're a liberal. And it's almost kind of like we prime each other with guarding against the ideas of other people, as opposed to just kind of letting people talk and be themselves and say their piece, and if you disagree with it, then you're able to disagree with it. And the skill of arguing, I think, has fallen in favor of just kind of echoing what your party tends to say. Just watching your TV channel with your party, and they say this, so I'm going to say this. And if I run out of quotes of my party, then uh-oh. Then it's less fun for me to be here this evening.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a very challenging development, and it's hard to address. You know, the ideas should be judged based on their own merits. That's the ideal. And to be fair, it can be hard to do that if you're not as familiar with a given topic.
Yeah.
Because you don't have as much to work with in terms of judging its veracity, its resilience to challenge, you know, its structural weaknesses or strengths, etc. So in that sense, it can be very hard. But you know, even in that case, it would be better to just take an open mind and just say, okay, I'm not familiar with this issue, but I'm going to listen to their argument, so that can be my starting point. You know, just by listening to someone does not mean you agree with them, and conceding that they have a point or that they might be right on something does not mean you have to adopt that person's position. It's quite possible to recognize weaknesses in your own position and strengths in the other person's position without changing your position right then and there. You know, you can take time to think about something, to do further research, to be introspective, to really kind of ponder on it before you change your position. So it's not as though listening to people and new ideas is inherently a threat. It's only as much of a threat, so to speak, as you allow it to be. You know, taking an open mind and just be willing to accept argumentation and ideas and information should be the goal, rather than, is what I believe right or not, yes or no? And then judging new information and ideas about whether or not it challenges that perspective. You know, if this information suggests I'm wrong, then it's bad information, you know. And if it's right, then it's confirmation bias, and then of course you accept it. I'm kind of meandering now at this point, so I'll let that go.
There's a Hitchens quote. I'll give two quotes of two people who I like related to that topic. Hitchens said, "Time spent arguing is rarely time wasted," something along those lines. And then Daniel Dennett said that if you're debating someone, ideally you should be able to explain your opponent's position so well that they would say, huh, I wish I would have thought to put it like that. Yeah. To have like a true understanding of where they're coming from, as opposed to a sort of straw man of trying to get a weakened version of their position that you're inoculated against, so that you don't have to listen to them. You can just let them talk and wait your turn and then say your piece. If you can actually understand not only what they think, but why they think it, then it's a lot easier to find some common ground and make some compromise and actually talk about something in a productive way.
Yeah, that's a very positive perspective. It's one I wish were more widely held. You know, that level of understanding, I think, is a much better bar for determining when people freak out.
Yeah.
As is the bar for freaking out is very low.
One thing that is a basic human fear is losing an argument. A lot of people put their own intelligence on the line and their self-worth on the line whenever they have a discussion, as opposed to a more exploratory mindset where, all right, I'm going to think about this with you, and we're going to try and get smarter together, as opposed to most people, I think, when they have a discussion, it's about, all right, who's the smarter person at the table tonight? And if you engage in an argument and you're proven wrong, then that means that your intelligence is questioned. No one can accept that.
Yeah, losing an argument is, you know, that really puts people off. That's like a judgment on them as a person.
Yeah.
Like their whole image, self-image, and especially it can be a problem for people who are anxious, because that just sets off all of those alarm bells. I mean, you just have to be patient. You know, you don't have to win an argument. You don't have to fight an argument. You know, an argument is not a battle. It's an exchange of ideas. You know, if you really know your stuff and you really know the other person's position, then it's easier just to be comfortable. But if you don't, I think the trick is to just be patient with both the other person and yourself. It's okay to be somewhat ignorant on it. It's okay to be ignorant. You know, don't feel bad about that, but just don't impose your ignorance as though that's equal to something or someone who has more information. You know, again, you should not feel threatened by someone having more information. You know, if you have a position, it's quite possible that if you did learn more about it, if you did incorporate that information that you did not know and did further research, you could end up with the same conclusion you had before. That's quite possible. So it's not inevitable that someone winning an argument with you means that you're wrong or that you're somehow a failure or that you've betrayed your ideals. So even from the partisan perspective, it shouldn't be that much of a problem. But it would be better still if you would not be wedded to a partisan ideal or ideology and just would accept that information is something that happens, you know, you're never going to reach a point of perfect knowledge. Knowledge is a journey, not a destination. It's something that's constantly happening. You're never going to reach a point where you know everything and have some kind of godlike divine understanding of the world or even of a given issue. So you should always be open to new ideas and information and etc.
Now, what about Alex Jones?
Well, he's got a lot of Wikipedia articles under his belt. He's got a lot of information there. He whips out. So some of that can be interesting. I didn't know what Rex 84 was until I listened to Alex Jones. So in that sense, yeah, there's some information there. And to be fair, that is a perspective. And given that that's a widely held perspective, it's an important one to understand. So again, you don't have to agree with the other person to recognize that understanding their perspective is important and that some of their information may have merit, even if you don't reach the same conclusions. I wish I were being clearer today on this. I seem to be muddling what I'm trying to say a lot. I apologize for not being more clear-headed.
Well, it makes sense to me, but I think part of the feeling you're getting is that we're kind of in the woods, as opposed to focused on some specific facts that we can just distribute. Yeah. This is more of how people are thinking about politics, which is related to the other questions that we've had and the question I had about the Russia investigation and stuff and political discourse in America, but it is in that territory where we don't know what the correct solution is and we can't just follow a build or a pattern and then fix everything. It's a mess.
Yeah. Yeah, I suppose it might help if part of my perspective is an academic perspective. I was trying to get a PhD for a long time. Not successful, but I was in the program. And you know, the academic perspective is that you never really know everything about a topic, and that you're always having to research things. You know, there's never a point at which somebody produces a paper and that's knowledge. Rather, you're constantly exploring something that nobody knows much about and building a body of evidence over time. And over a long enough period of time, with a large enough body of evidence, then you can start treating something as something that is probably true. A given idea with enough evidence supporting it, and with weak enough criticisms of it, that could be treated as though it could be true, and that's about as much as you can hope for, because absolute truth is not really possible. That's sort of how science and inquiry is treated within academia. And so that I think would be a better bar by which to measure discourse and to hold discourse than Crossfire on CNN and the bar that represents. And that's difficult because, again, that's not comforting. It's not comforting to say, I don't know. You want knowledge. You want to know how the world works. You want to know, you want to have a hard position that you can hold to, because that's easier to defend, easier to understand, and easier to enforce. But the academic perspective, which I think is more realistic, because you really can't ever really know something per se, unless you're in like a really hard science. But of course, we're not talking about physics, we're talking about social science, social issues. Not being able to hold down, a fixed, hard position as something that is always true, always has been, and always will be. That's hard for people to accept. That's part of the reason religion is so successful, because religion does have hard, concrete answers to social issues, like uncertainty, loneliness, etc. Having a purpose in life. These kinds of social, existential questions are really difficult to deal with scientifically. And so, instead of making an argument that just hey, everything is uncertain, just learn how to handle it, religion steps in and says, here are some values, here are certainties, here are things that you can guide your life by. And that's very comforting to people, and it's very helpful, because some people need that in order to get by. And to kind of editorialize, I don't think people should be begrudged for that, because I know that's religion has become the subject of a great deal of criticism over time. Much of it deserved, to be fair. There are issues there, but I don't think the answer to that is eradicating religion. I think it's to kind of pick out the strengths of religion and to emphasize those and to deal with the issues as they arise. Again, that's me editorializing, which I try not to do in general. That's one of my little rules. That's kind of in recognition of the fact that people will kind of shut you out if they perceive you to be of a particular perspective. I try to be unbiased on here in general, and when talking about policy issues and, if not broader philosophy, just to be, so that I can be as inclusive as possible, and to try to engage as many people as possible. And if I suck at that, if I'm failing at that, I encourage people to post in chat and tell me how I'm failing at that, because I would like to be better at that.
Well, one thing that I've noticed is you may not agree with a particular position. If you go the mile to insult them and their whole demographic, you're not going to make any progress with them on any topic, period. That's basically just closing the door. And some people like feeling like they're superior after saying something like that, but for the long-term practicality of your discussion, you basically just shut them down, and they're not really going to engage with you anymore. You're getting pegged like a villain, pretty much. If you're going to be like, oh yeah, all the people of X religion or Y religion are idiots. And then it's like, you just called me and all my family and stuff idiots. I don't like you very much.
Yeah, I mean, people who do that are really making it more about them than they are about the ideas. And that kind of betrays the fact that politics for those kinds of people is more about ego than it is about governance or the policy in question or right versus wrong. It's more about sort of self-inflation and just more about presenting themselves as superior rather than proselytizing. If you really believe that you have the one true faith, that your ideology is uniquely right, it's still quite possible to have a civil exchange of ideas with another person. And that is the most effective form of proselytizing. When Christians go overseas to proselytize, they don't use a sledgehammer approach. There's a lot of nuance. They've got it down to a science. They're very effective at it. It's a very nuanced diplomatic approach they take to try to convert people to Christianity from their traditional beliefs. A similar dynamic is at play when you're sort of trying to convince somebody of your ideas. If you are really arguing for your idea versus something else, it behooves you to take a gentle diplomatic proselytizing approach rather than just a hard insulting approach. Implicit in insulting an idea and someone for their ideas is the notion that somehow your respect is important to them. That if they were to change their ideas, then you would stop insulting them and would start respecting them. But really, the respect of somebody who does that is not really worth very much. So even within the internal logic of the person doing that, of the insulting, it doesn't really make a lot of sense. There's just no internal rationale there on a number of levels. So, long story short, the moral of the story is, please don't do that.
Please stop calling me an idiot.
Let's see, assuming no gun grab, by what mechanism do you suppose that gun violence would be lower with the new gun controls? Quite curious by what mode you think that decrease would manifest itself. So purely off the top of my head, because I haven't done deep research in this, but intuitively I would think that having, well, for example, let's assume you have like really strong gun control and that the amount of gun ownership, illegal gun ownership amongst the broader population were to fall. If that were to happen, I would expect, just intuitively, that gun accidents would fall correspondingly. So by that mechanism, I would expect gun deaths, just again, broadly defined gun deaths, to fall, if only because of that. That's assuming that were not offset by an increase in gun deaths by some other mechanism that would result from a widespread fall in legal gun ownership. So, you know, again, I recognize I could be wrong on that in that regard. But in general, I would expect if there were a broad fall in the amount of guns owned legally by the broader population, I would expect that there would probably be a corresponding fall of some degree, not even necessarily a huge fall, just some decrease in overall gun deaths. And again, just a fall in gun accidents, I would expect at least would occur as a result of that. Let's see. So I would welcome criticism on that point, because again, that's not necessarily my area, so I would be interested in what people who are more versed in that issue would think about that perspective. I don't read chat while I do this, for anyone who isn't familiar with this segment, but I do read the chat after we're done. And I'll, you know, sometimes if somebody wants, I'll even respond to somebody who says something in chat in the next episode, if I see it, and if, you know, they kind of directly ask me something. So, you know, again, I greatly encourage participation. I learn as much out of these as anybody else. And I do want that. That is one of the things I enjoy about it, is kind of the interchange and exchange of ideas with other people in chat, as well as with you, Neuro.
It's a learning stream, wow.
Let's see, so can the WTO limit, and does it have instruments against Trump in his purpose to cut the American trade deals and improve the inner economic power of the U.S., while the overall picture of nations is suffering from those changes? I would add here before, I would, oh, what's the word I want? Preclude? Precede? The word escapes me. Well, before I answer this, I'll just say that we're not quite at the point where the international trade regime is being seriously threatened by the Trump administration. He makes a lot of noise about it, but he hasn't really done a lot tangibly to really change the international trade regime. There have been some movements, and there's been some negotiations, for example, the NAFTA renegotiations, and there have been some tariffs, like against the tariffs placed on washing machines from South Korea, for example. But he hasn't really gone out of his way to make it a priority, and that makes me wonder if it isn't just mostly for show. So in that sense, I wouldn't worry too much about it. It's not too damaging at this point. That could change, but at this point, not that big a problem. But the crux of the question: can the WTO limit, and does it have instruments against any such effort by the Trump administration? Not kind of. The WTO dispute resolution mechanism does allow states to impose retaliatory tariffs. So if the United States were to unilaterally impose tariffs in a given for a given product, if not just broadly, other states in the WTO would be within their rights to implement tariffs of their own in order to offset that. One of the trends over the past 10-20 years has been the emergence of strategic tariffs. Strategic, well, not sanctions, but yeah, strategic tariffs, wherein you specifically create tariffs targeting specific goods or classes of goods that are designed to impact politically sensitive areas in a specific country. And so in the case of the United States, that might involve steel tariffs, because Steel is an important product in the Midwest, and if that industry is negatively impacted by targeted tariffs, that uniquely impacts the political popularity of the current government in power in the United States in that area. And the government would be particularly sensitive to that because that is a sort of swing area, like Ohio, for example, is a swing state. So people fight over Ohio to win the presidency. And so having the people there be upset with you because you did something that caused Europe to impose tariffs on one of their big industries, that's a big political problem as well as an economic problem. So targeted tariffs are kind of an emerging strategic tool, and it may be that tariffs, retaliatory tariffs against a set of Trump tariffs, so to speak, would be designed in that vein. They might design industries in Ohio, Florida, specifically, in order to bring extra political pressure to bear beyond the economic pressure brought to bear by tariffs, in order to try to coerce the U.S. administration into returning to form, basically, into kind of returning to the standard schedule of tariffs, the standard, the pre-existing tariff regime, put it like that. So the WTO does have that. That's probably the principal instrument through which WTO member states could enforce the current trade regime. The WTO itself doesn't really have much it can do. I mean, the WTO is basically just mutual agreement to lower tariffs. The dispute resolution courts, the arbitration system within it, is more just a means to kind of ensure that states are nominally adhering to that tariff regime, to that trading regime. But you're never really required, per se, to adhere to a arbitration case ruling. You could ignore it. In turn, the other state that brought the case against you could impose retaliatory tariffs, but if you're willing to suffer those retaliatory tariffs, or if you could apply pressure to cause them to back down, if you have a superior negotiating position, the WTO would have no way to enforce its ruling. It really does just depend on the member states to kind of adhere to it. The fact that the trading regime has survived as long as it has under such a weak enforcement mechanism is testament to the degree to which the member nations in the WTO recognize a common interest in maintaining an open international trading regime, and their willingness to give up some sovereignty as regards tariffs in order to maintain said regime. The Trump administration, especially being the administration of a very powerful country, the United States, is in a unique position to threaten that regime. But, you know, if they were really going to threaten it, again, I think they would have done it by now. I think they are more interested in political victories more than anything. You know, specific examples of what they could call unfair trade practices, making an example out of those, and then using that as evidence that they're promoting an economic nationalist agenda amongst their constituents. I think that's more the objective, rather than just completely flipping over the whole trading regime and designing it in a sort of mercantilist way that benefits the United States specifically. So, I guess the short answer to the question is, the WTO cannot really limit the United States from damaging the trading regime, international trading regime, and it has very weak instruments to restrict the Trump administration if it did that. But the flip side is that there is a lot of agreement internationally that the trading regime is worth preserving, and the Trump administration itself recognizes some benefit and has largely only really sought to damage it in a limited way, in a way that is politically advantageous to them in domestic American politics. I'm sorry if that's a somewhat confusing answer. That's a little bit all over the place. Let's see. Could you please talk about the influence of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights? Okay. So if I'm remembering it correctly, there's no guarantee I am. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights is sort of the Bill of Rights, so to speak, of the UN. It was part of the UN Charter that was signed in San Francisco in 1946, I think it was. Maybe it was 45. So the UN, the UDHR, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, you know, the influence of that has mostly been more psychological almost, more political. It's not really so much important legally. And I would tie that into my previous statements about the UN and its level of influence. The UN doesn't really have a means of enforcing the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So it is more of a symbolic document in that way. It has served to kind of inspire people to kind of set that as the gold standard, as the international norm, so to speak, of what constitutes good governance and human rights. But on the other hand, without an enforcement mechanism, it's really up to individual states the degree to which they actually adhere to it. And it's quite possible for different political groups to kind of eschew it, because it's easy to kind of bend it depending on given political issues. To kind of give an example, if you're a Buddhist Rakhine, if you're a Rakhine Buddhist in Burma right now, / Myanmar, then you would not necessarily consider, well, you might admit that the abuse of the Rohingyas is an abuse of their human rights, but you might legitimize it given historical context, given issues with demographic change and issues with the government not doing anything about it, etc. So even if people broadly recognize that human rights are a good thing and that the UDHR is the gold standard, that doesn't mean that people won't, given in individual circumstances, legitimize abrogations of the ideals of the UDHR. And in those cases, there's not a lot you can do. It just comes down to the state's willingness to kind of fight that, resist that impulse, or to kind of facilitate it, depending on their own interests. So I would argue the influence of the UDHR is somewhat limited overall. I think it's an important document. I think it is something that people who are for human rights and are pushing for human rights in their respective countries can point to as part of their overarching argument for why human rights and liberalization are good things and would be positive developments for their respective countries. But beyond that, it doesn't have any weight behind it. There's just no enforcement mechanism, and it's easy to just kind of ignore it or to rationalize abuses, which limits its impact, limits its influence.
It's one of those things where, like we were saying before, it's not an organization that has a ton of direct power. It's more of a body that decides what people should do, and it's one of those, well, if you don't do this, we'll be very disappointed in you.
Yeah, there's kind of echoes of the Holy Roman Empire there in that regard, kind of a similarly constructed institution. Let's see, have you followed Jordan Peterson and his story? Do you follow the loose smattering of folks now sometimes called the quote-unquote intellectual dark web? I've seen some interviews with Jordan Peterson, but I don't know that I would consider myself an acolyte per se. I haven't really followed him closely, and this is the first time I've heard of the quote-unquote intellectual dark web. So no, I'm not that familiar with it overall. I think somebody did ask me what I thought of Jordan Peterson in general, so we did kind of touch on that last week, but I don't think I would really have anything to add to that per se. I couldn't really get into it more than that.
From what I understand, he's one of the academics who has kind of taken the step into the spotlight as a public intellectual, who's offering his opinion on a wide variety of topics unrelated to his area of expertise. So kind of like Noam Chomsky in that capacity, where you started from an area in academia where maybe you made a lot of progress on some front, but then you're just up for talking about a bunch of current issues. Like, I think one of the ones where Jordan Peterson has kind of set himself on a firm stance is the political correctness kind of culture nowadays, where it's more and more of a thing to try and avoid offending people, and he's taken a stance against that. And a lot of people kind of like that sort of approach, where it's less about being sensitive and compassionate about different people's wishes. There are a lot of different kinds of things to be aware of nowadays, and a lot of people get pretty overwhelmed by that process of people want to be treated in a particular way, and, well, I don't care about figuring out all those different ways. He's been, I think, on that side of the spectrum. Personally, yeah. I'm more on the other side. Packed Facts is super hardcore. We need to be way more compassionate. There are lots of really terrible issues, and it's not that hard to connect with people, so I'm kind of working more from that position. But just because you're not in a particular camp doesn't mean you can't discuss with us and give us your perspective.
Yeah. Yeah, he is well spoken, I think, and I do think he presents his arguments well, and I think he has some legitimate points to be. I think he does have legitimate points in a lot of cases, but you know, in general, some of his argumentation is a bit weak, in my opinion. Some of it, not all of it, but I think there are things that I would take issue with. Yeah, he's. I think the thing that really made him famous was the. What was it? It was that law in Canada. And I think that did get passed, in which you could be prosecuted. Is that? I hope there's some Canadians listening who can help me out on this, who can kind of elaborate on this a bit. I think the law stated that you could be prosecuted if you did not refer to people according to their identified gender. And I think he took great issue with that. I think he saw that as a great as an example of state overreach, as an imposition, an unnecessary imposition by the state. And I'm sure he had a deeper argument as to why he opposed it that I can't get into because I don't know what it is. But I do recall that being a significant event for him. It's one of the things that kind of propelled him into the limelight. But yeah, I mean, I guess the short answer to the question is no and no. No, I haven't really followed Jordan Peterson and his story, and no, I have not followed the intellectual dark web, such as it is. I would have to look that up. I don't even really. I guess that could refer to the people who follow Jordan Peterson. That perspective, I guess you could say that refers to that perspective. And no, I don't go out of my way to follow any particular ideology or group or what have you. So I can't say that I'm up to date on that and what their argumentation is. Let's see. What subjects do you consider yourself to be an expert in beyond just general economics, politics? Well, I definitely wouldn't consider myself an expert in politics. That's a bit outside my ambit. I have some peripheral exposure to it because a lot of the stuff I did in economics, specifically political economics, that kind of overlapped some with politics. So I'm more familiar with politics than a pure economist would be. But I wouldn't call myself a political scientist by any stretch, and I definitely really haven't read much political science literature. What I studied was, well, I have 2 master's degrees, one in economics and one in public affairs. And so I have a strong background in political economy. That's probably the closest thing I have to a field of expertise, although even there I would be hesitant. I didn't get my PhD, so I don't really like calling myself an expert. You know, maybe an almost expert. I passed the qualifier, but I didn't get past the dissertation stage. I was all but dissertation when I dropped out for a number of reasons. You know, that's a whole other discussion. But political economy, maybe. Foreign policy, that's kind of been more of a hobby, a long-running hobby. So I know relatively more about that than the average bear, maybe. And I would not call myself an expert in economics, but I'm more familiar with it given the background, given the graduate level education. International trade, you know, within economics, you can kind of break it down. So things like international trade, institutions, that's again political economy kind of overlapping there. And then to a degree, macroeconomic theory and microeconomic theory. I guess I could break down foreign policy too, so things like wars, treaties, history, you know, that, you know, again, that's kind of getting the history of political economic institutions. There's a lot of overlap there, again, with political institutions, because political institutions are important to the economy. There's a lot of interaction there. There's a lot of studying of one in order to understand the other. So I guess that would be kind of the list of things that I know the most about. History is more just a hobby as well, and there's just a lot of reading in the spare time. That's kind of more where the knowledge there comes from. And then just reading the news every day. You know, if you pay attention to the news every day, you can learn a lot just through kind of osmosis. Because different issues, different political disputes, different territorial disputes, international conflicts, etc., they tend to flare up repeatedly in the news. And so you kind of learn about them as you go and build up a background with them. And then, of course, you can do your own additional research to build a further background. And if you do that over the course of 20, 30 years, you end up with a large base of information to work with. Having a large base of information doesn't make you an expert, unfortunately, but it were otherwise. But it does help you kind of build arguments and help you, puts you in a better position to critique ideas and other people's arguments, since you kind of have more ammunition, so to speak. But beyond that, yeah, not much. That's pretty much the gamut. See, on the problem of finding consensus within political discourse, do you have any suggestions on how to deconstruct the arguments, or rather, to what baseline before building them up again in order to find consensus? So how do you build consensus? Well, I don't know that building consensus necessarily even requires you to deconstruct someone else's argument. I mean, it would almost be better if you didn't, in a way. If you just assume the other person is an adult and you're equal and is equally informed, and you just assume that their conclusions are representations of their personal political preferences, if that's your starting point, then it's much easier to reach consensus. Well, also the other person has to also recognize those things in you and your argument. But if you have that mutual recognition, then it's very easy to reach a point of consensus, because then you can just say, okay, let's split the difference, or let's sacrifice this thing to get the other thing, etc. You can kind of prioritize different issues and then make a horse trade, so to speak, as necessary to reach an equilibrium. But as far as deconstructing an argument to reach consensus, that's difficult, because a lot of people, unfortunately, will interpret attempts to deconstruct their argument as being a kind of hostile proselytizing, you know, kind of a hostile, almost an insult. And so that's a difficult kind of approach to take. One of the things you can do is, and you know, this isn't even a solution, it's just a tactic, so to speak. One method you can use is to phrase your criticism as a question. So, you know, don't say that this is wrong, what you're saying is wrong, here's the fact that proves you're wrong. You can just ask, is that true? Or if you want to be more specific, is it true that this thing does this other thing that you're saying it does? And then you could in turn say, okay, well, I mean, you can kind of extrapolate from there and kind of go on from there. If you just phrase it as a question, that makes their conclusions more their conclusions rather than you imposing your conclusions on them. And so that's a little more conducive to a passive, well-reasoned exchange rather than an emotive, heated exchange. And a lot of patience also is helpful, because it's easy for people to kind of get impatient and then just sort of, you know, get frustrated and give up or kind of turn on the other person. You really have to be patient with them and also with yourself. You know, don't expect to kind of be able to convert a person or be able to hold a well-reasoned argument, well-reasoned and civil argument especially, right off the bat. You know, it takes practice. It's a skill. You know, kind of like what Neuro was saying, argumentation is a skill. And it takes practice to do, and it takes some time to be able to talk with people who disagree with you, and especially with people who disagree with you and are not particularly civil about it. Dealing with those people in a way that is conducive to civil argumentation and exchange of ideas, it just requires experience most of all. You just kind of have to learn how given types of people of given backgrounds and given ideas and ideological preferences think, how they think, and why they think the way they do, in order to kind of learn the best approaches and types of dialogue to take in order to really communicate with them and penetrate ideological armor. And once you build up a kind of catalog of approaches that correspond with given people, ideas, etc., then you can pretty regularly kind of pull it off, so to speak. But, you know, there's no one silver bullet, so to speak. There's no one thing you can do that is going to induce consensus. It's a skill that requires learning and practice and experience, and you just kind of have to build it up. If you can, it's great, because then you can kind of be the person that sort of synthesizes ideas and acts as the diplomat and kind of brings people together. You know, acting as a diplomat and bringing people together of different ideologies is a particularly difficult manifestation of this. That's like advanced level. That's like advanced level consensus building. So I definitely wouldn't set that as the bar for where to start if you are kind of just starting out in terms of building this skill. That's going to be something you get to much later. But yeah, that's my advice on that, I guess. It's just something that takes a lot of work.
That was one of the skills that Kukyo was especially good at, was engaging with people who didn't agree with them, and he didn't really make them feel threatened. Mm-hmm. They felt comfortable talking with him, even if they kind of had a suspicion that he was working from an opposing position. And a large part of that was because he was interested in really knowing your position. Not just what side you're on, but what makes your position unique. And I think the effort to pursue that in a conversation, for one, makes people feel really good because someone cares. Someone cares what I think about this subject. And that's really cool. It makes people feel good. And if you can allow them to open up, a lot of times it becomes more of a fun quest of he's trying to understand my position, and at the same time he's kind of bumping into some territory that maybe I hadn't considered before. So it becomes an interesting exercise of how can we get a better sense of what's really going on here, as opposed to, uh-oh, this is a person on the other side of the spectrum and it's a battle now. What are my top 10 quips that we can just throw at each other that sound really fun when we say them, but it doesn't actually move anyone in any direction?
Yeah. Yeah, he was very good at that. I do miss talking with him in general, but also listening to him to talk to other people. It was always fun to listen to his conversation and his approach to exchanging ideas with people, talking with people, sharing his perspective, understanding their perspective. He was very proficient at that.
What was more of a hot topic for me and a lot of my friends in university than political stance was religion. And he was someone who was raised Protestant Christian in kind of the south and southeast of the US, and he was no longer a believer, but of people who don't believe anymore, he was one of the more compassionate and one of the better listeners, where he liked to hear what a Christian had to say about a given topic, as opposed to kind of ruling them all out and being like, oh, they're all idiots. There were a lot of those people at university as well who maybe they were religious at one point, they weren't anymore, and they were on a sort of crusade to demonstrate how stupid all of them were, as opposed to appreciating this is a human's perspective. We're all ignorant about most things that go on. So if we can be open with each other, then it's likely that we'll improve in some capacity. People get very invested, so you can't really expect just to have one conversation and to change someone's mind on something. It's more of grains of rice, and maybe someone's scales will be tipped, but the majority of the time you can just add a little bit on either side, or not, and that's okay too.
Yeah, the incremental conversational approach is, as you say, much better and more effective, I think, than the sort of absolute truth kind of fire and brimstone approach. You know, repent ye sinners. I don't know that people are really that responsive to that.
One thing that I noticed watching a lot of debates on theology, does God exist? If God exists, is it a force for good in the universe? Is Christianity true? A lot of these different topics, and a theme with debates is usually a debate is being done primarily for the open minds who are on the fence currently. People who are believers of something or disbelievers for decades aren't really super likely to change their stance just by watching a debate. They can enjoy it. They can enjoy how the conversation develops, which side tends to be winning, who's more charismatic, which side is winning the crowd, that kind of thing. But really, the fence sitters are the ones who are up for grabs, as opposed to trying to win the whole room. That never really happens, even if one side is clearly in the right, factually speaking. Oh my goodness, some people are still on about guns in the chat. It's a very spicy topic. It's actually kind of surprising because I'm someone who doesn't really care too much about guns. It's never been an item that I was particularly interested in, but some people love guns, and that's cool. It's cool to have hobbies. It's cool to be interested with stuff.
Yeah, that online discussion of gun debates, that's like a never-ending carousel. It just keeps going round and around. I look forward to reading the chat later. I'm sure it's engaging, if nothing else.
One thing that has come up tonight, and has come up a few other times whenever guns are brought up as a topic, is the types of guns and what actually is an assault rifle even a type of gun? I don't know enough about guns to definitively say, oh, any gun of these specifications should be allowed and this should not. I don't know shit about guns. It's more like the broad strokes of trying to figure out what's going on, as opposed to neither of us are gun experts. So if you have gun-specific questions, there are probably other places to look.
Yeah, maybe we could get a Ouija board for Kukio. I'm sure he would love to get into it.
Yeah, he was big into material. Actually, on his hard drive, there was a folder that was just pictures of 50 cals and different kinds of guns that he thought looked really cool. He liked how they worked, the mechanics of how it fires a projectile so fast. The science of guns.
Yeah, he had a real comprehensive understanding of the science and physics behind their engineering. You know, it's not just that he was a gun nut. It's not just that he just liked guns. He really had an appreciation for them as an invention, as a device, as a mechanism.
Have you ever gone shooting before?
Yeah, I went shooting with him once.
Nice. Yeah, me too. I didn't realize how loud guns were. They're very loud. Calm down, guns. Jeez.
Yeah, the loudness got me, and the recoil surprised me.
Yeah, because it's not in movies or TV.
Yeah, it's really not. It's really not.
People just hold their gun and it doesn't even move.
Yeah, if you want some cheap entertainment, you can go onto YouTube and just Google small girls with guns and just watch them getting smacked in the head. There was a very petite woman who had a Desert Eagle, which is a 50 caliber handgun. And that thing just about flew through her head, just bam, right back into her face. I mean, recoil on weapons is immensely powerful, and especially on a high caliber weapon. It's not something that translates well on screen. It's really something you have to feel. Anyway, I'm getting off topic.
Guns.
Yeah, it was a real pleasure to listen to Kukio talk about guns. I know that sounds strange for some people, but you know, he really made it interesting.
Well, I think there's something to be said about listening to anyone who has a good bit of knowledge about a topic that you know fuck all about. And I would say between the two of us, we know about fuck all about guns.
Yeah. Yeah, Kukio was our guy in that way. How did we get onto that?
There were people in the chat who are still talking about guns, and I
pointed that out. Gotcha. Oh, what type of gun is this, and why that's semantics? Yeah, that's the type of gun is kind of irrelevant to the overarching argument about gun control, gun violence, and preferences therein. You know, it might be good to point out here also something else I've said before, which is that you know, political preferences are kind of more important. There are trade-offs to every policy debate. You know, the policy debate invariably is going to end in a set of policy options, or perhaps a set of policy spectrums, and then you're going to decide which to pick based on a compromise reached between preferences. And again, like I said earlier, political preferences are not necessarily informed only by empirical data. There's also a sort of qualitative aspect, you know, people's personal feelings, tradition, etc. Those factor in as well. So that's something to kind of keep in mind. It's not just about pure data. There is that element of just personal preference that comes into it, and that kind of has to be recognized and accepted if compromise is to be reached. So let's see, the next question. Why does it seem that intelligent, reasonable people can't work together and build a bigger movement? It seems easy answers are picked up more often and spread, but well thought out stuff is barely mentioned. Well, I mean, most people I don't think are really that engaged with politics. And I don't think it's entirely fair, and well, I would argue it's not fair to expect everybody to have a deep understanding of every single political issue. You know, people have lives, they have responsibilities, they have jobs, they have issues of their own, tragedies, etc. So people just don't necessarily have a lot of time to devote to a full comprehensive reading of a given subject. And, you know, that's almost what you kind of need in order to really get into the deep policy detail, debate details of a given issue, especially when it comes to actually designing concrete policy action, you know, institutional design, policy trade-offs, etc., that kind of thing. So, given that information asymmetry between actors, it's no surprise then that people have difficulty kind of organizing, because people have to rely on heuristics, sort of heuristic techniques and approaches in order to kind of reach an understanding of the wider world in general, but also an understanding of a given political issue. That in turn makes it difficult to coordinate people, because then the criteria by which they judge the issue is somewhat arbitrary, and it's hard to kind of understand as an outsider if you don't necessarily understand that person's perspective. You know, there's just a lot more variance now. Well, not even now, just always has been. It's like herding cats, almost. You know, you have to create a message that appeals to a very wide group of people who are very diverse in background, in opinion, in political preferences, etc. And that's just innately difficult in and of itself. But doing it in a way that's compelling, and that induces people to try to spread that message and sort of participate actively in a given movement, that's a whole nother level of difficulty. And what you'll find is that the more detailed and elaborate and, well, long that a given explanation or effort at proselytizing is, the less people kind of are interested and the less sort of excited they become. You know, it becomes more droll at that point. If you want to be a successful PR guy, which is effectively what you're talking about, public relations, if you really want to compel people and get them to help out and get excited and get involved, you kind of need something, a shorter message, a more concise message. You need a message that's kind of easier to understand, is more simple and more emotive. And that's more effective at engendering involvement by the target demographic. But the trade-off there is that then the people do not necessarily have as deep an understanding, and are then vulnerable to manipulations either by your opponent or by people with alternative agendas of some sort or another. So it's a messy business, organizing a movement. It's hard to do. You kind of need a lot of highly motivated people, and then you need a lot of patience, because a lot of what defines a successful movement is timing. You know, take Rosa Parks, for example. Rosa Parks, for those who don't know, Rosa Parks was an African-American woman who was part of the civil rights movement in the United States during the 1950s. And she famously was thrown off a bus because she was sitting in the front. And perhaps I need to explain that too, because that might sound strange to some people. At that time in American history, it was sort of a norm, kind of a rule. I don't think it was ever a written, but it was just a norm, that white people sat at the front of the bus and black people sat at the back of the bus, because sitting at the front is better, because you don't have to walk as far to get out of the bus, basically. And well, Rosa Parks challenged that, sat at the front of the bus in order to challenge the overarching segregationist regime at the time in the South. And she was arrested, and that, of course, brought a lot of media attention that engendered a lot of political support in the north of the United States for the civil rights movement. And it was kind of a turning point for the movement because at that point they had a lot more allies in the north that could help them in the movement, whereas before they'd kind of been more isolated in the south. Now here's the thing about Rosa Parks. Not only did she do that on purpose, not only was that a purposeful effort to challenge segregation, it was actually part of a trend. She was not the only person who was trying to do that. There was actually a number of women, well, probably people, not just women. There was actually a number of people who had done the same thing, who had sat in front of the bus and been arrested for it. Rosa Parks was just the one that the media caught on, right? She was just the one that happened to get media attention, national media attention specifically. And that was a purposeful strategy implemented by civil rights organizations. They specifically went out of their way to say, okay, this is something that we want our members to do if they're willing to take the risk. And then a number of them did, and then one of them got the desired media attention. So there was a strategy, there was an objective, there was a method decided upon, and there was implementation. They saw it through. It took some time. There was a lot of people who got arrested and did not engender national media attention, but there was perseverance and patience, and they eventually pulled it off. So I think those are also important characteristics for a successful movement: patience, and well, also perseverance, but that kind of goes without saying. Let's see, why does it... I guess the question specified intelligent, reasonable people can't work together. Why can't intelligent, reasonable people work together? Intelligent, reasonable people are the hardest people of all to organize, because they're the most stubborn. You know, if you're not as familiar with the topic, but you have a kind of emotive connection with it, an emotional connection with it, it's somewhat easier to manipulate you, and it's easier to kind of get you on board a movement, especially if the movement doesn't necessarily require a lot of participation of you, just sort of casual participation. On the other hand, really well-informed, intelligent, reasonable people often are very set in their ways. They're often very confident in their perspective and ideas, and so they can be very upset with the given direction of a movement, or the way the movement frames the issue at hand, or something to that effect. And as a result, they can be very recalcitrant and reluctant to get involved. You know, they kind of feel entitled to a certain voice in the movement, and they're easily put off in that regard. So I guess ego, in a sense. Part of the reason it's hard to kind of organize intelligent people of the sort you're describing is that they tend to have larger egos, and egos easily clash and can easily serve to sabotage a given movement. You see some of that in India with the, what's it called? The APP, I think, or the AAP. Can't quite remember exactly which it was. Basically, it was a reformist movement. You know, in India, the political culture and politics in general are very much defined by party politics, you know, sort of big boss politics. So a couple of people in India, specifically I think New Delhi, started up a sort of grassroots reformist political party. And it was led by a guy named Kejriwal, I think, I want to say. I'm probably getting that wrong, but I think that's what his name was. And that movement eventually lost a lot of members because the guy who led the movement, again, Kejriwal, I think his name was, had a number of disputes with other leading figures in the party who did not want to run the party the way he wanted to, who disagreed with certain decisions he was making. And you know, those people were summarily expelled from the party, basically. They were basically forced out. And it became less of a reformist party and more of a Kejriwal party. And, you know, somewhat ironically, that's actually the same genesis that a number of the big boss political parties in India had. A lot of them started as broader movements, but then kind of coalesced around single personalities and became more personality-driven than platform-driven. So that's an example of how smart people can kind of let their egos get in the way of overarching organization, movement, reform, etc.
Another term that we learn in psychology and brain science is idea inoculation, which the process is similar to inoculation against a disease. You add a dead version or a weakened version of that disease or that idea, and you give it to that person so they can feel as though they've conquered it. So whenever they face that idea in the wild or in public discourse, they are basically immune to it influencing them in any capacity. So an example would be something like atheists are evil. Well, why are atheists evil? They eat babies and they have no morals, and it's just orgies and unspeakable acts all the time. And so when someone talks with an atheist, they're basically not going to be accepting any new ideas as valid or worth considering because they've been treated with that kind of idea inoculation of these are dangerous people, we don't listen to them. You can say words at them and they might say words at you, but not in the way that you open yourself up to being flexible or adjusting your position in any way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very common, especially amongst institutionalized ideologies. You see that, with the political parties and their specific followers here in the United States. You see that with religious institutions in South Asia. In particular with the Hindutva are really exemplifying that in India right now, to kind of return to that example. But in general, it's very common. It's not really easy to counter. Yeah. Again, a soft, patient approach is best there, I think. Would you agree, Neuro?
Pretty much always.
Yeah.
What about a loud spitting approach? Just foaming at the mouth and shouting as loud as you can.
Well, it might feel good. So I suppose there may be some catharsis in that for some people.
People are hiding under their desks and chairs. God, get down.
I don't know that I would encourage it. Let's see. What do you think of the billionaire class buying properties in remote places like New Zealand? Some have suggested that they're planning for a civilizational collapse. Others have commented that the billionaires are complicit in any such collapse. Yeah, I actually posted something about this on my Twitter account. There was a story about New Zealand considering legislation to restrict foreign investment in the housing market. So, what do you think of the billionaire class buying properties? Okay, so this isn't so much about the housing market, but about the foreign investors, okay. What do I think of foreign investors buying property in places like New Zealand? Is that a bolt hole, so to speak? Is that kind of a exit strategy in case something goes wrong in their home country, so they can kind of run away to this place they invested in and hide out? Yeah, if you're like a really powerful person, like if you're a billionaire, and especially if you got to be a billionaire in a society with a fractious political system, like say China, where politics is a blood sport, it really kind of behooves you to have a few escape hatches available. And it may well be that political developments in China change, or whatever country you're from, change such that you are in imminent danger. Being arrested or imprisoned or assassinated even, being murdered. Those are all well within the realm of possibility if you live in a society where politics has no real rules. So if you sense that danger, it's nice to have someplace you can go that's very far away. And it's hard to get much further away from the world than New Zealand. That makes it particularly attractive. You really have to really want to kill somebody if you're willing to go all the way to New Zealand. So that's a nice little moat you have between you and the rest of the world there in New Zealand. But in general, even places like Vancouver or Europe or wherever, just anywhere that's far away from your country of origin can be a good kind of safe zone for you. Although it's not impervious. There was a guy who did that, who was Vietnamese. He was a former leading businessman, I think, if not official, in Vietnam. There's not a lot of difference in a political system like Vietnam. Generally, if you're a powerful political figure, you also dabble in business. So, kind of both, probably, if I'm remembering correctly. But he tried to run away to Europe after he got into trouble. Some corruption business that he got into. And really, corruption is not necessarily a problem per se in a political system that is itself corrupt in general. The issue was more fighting over distribution of resources. The political faction he was in got trounced, and his political opponents came after them. So he got out of Dodge. Well, he left Vietnam. Get the hell out of Dodge is an American saying here. It just means you're escaping, you're leaving. And he left for Europe, and he was there for a while, and then he mysteriously disappeared. And it turned out that he had been kidnapped by the Vietnamese, by basically people employed by the Vietnamese government, and who had returned him to Vietnam to stand trial. And I think he was in Germany. The German government was not terribly pleased with that, but of course there wasn't much they could do about it. It was pretty much a done deal. And so when he resurfaced in Vietnam for his trial, basically there was a lot of hand-wringing and complaining, but no specific action taken. No substantive action taken, anyway. But are they preparing for a civilizational collapse? Others have commented that the billionaires are complicit in any such collapse. I don't think they're planning for a civilizational collapse. I think they're just sort of hedging their bets, like I sort of just described. You know, if there was a civilizational collapse, there would really be nowhere they could go. There's no safe spot that you can kind of run away to if the entire world civilization collapses in on itself. It more, I think, comes down to trouble in their own countries of origin and a desire to escape political troubles there. Let's see. So I hope that's a satisfactory answer to that question. Please let me know. Do you know any interesting news about the energy sector, i.e. oil, coal, etc.? Any interesting news about the energy sector? I'd have to think about it. Not lately. Let's put it like that. I haven't heard anything lately that would be considered interesting. Well, there was something I was reading not long ago about... what was it? Something about coal, I think.
I've seen a bunch of stuff saying that a lot of renewables are overtaking the existing energy market in terms of their efficiency for cost. So solar and wind are moving up quite a bit in terms of their widespread use, which ultimately I feel like that was the force that would win the game over the long term for renewables, which is make them more efficient for investment and for profit, not just because it's destroying the planet. That has pretty clearly not been a sufficient motivator for change.
Yeah.
You've got to make it worth it for people's dollar. They want the return on investment, not just to save the trees.
Yeah, unfortunately, that's very much the case. We're not quite at such a developed stage of human civilization that we could do otherwise.
I think we talked about this in one of the earlier episodes, where tackling climate change is something that is going to be the most beneficial to our descendants as opposed to ourselves, which is a very, very abstract thing for an animal to invest in. I'm going to invest in future generations that I won't live through myself because I think that matters. I think for most people they can pretty easily dismiss that just because it's very abstract and kind of modern.
Yeah. Okay, well, here are 4 stories. Here are 4 quick stories off the top of my head that are relevant to the energy sector. Not necessarily about the energy sector, but relevant. Tariffs have been applied in the United States onto solar panel imports. That was done by the Trump administration in response to allegations of dumping from China. Chinese producers were accused of selling their solar panels below cost of production, basically, just so that they could seize market share. And so that ties into the overarching sort of story that we've been following about the international trade regime and Trump's economic nationalist agenda, such as it is. Like I said earlier, I don't think it's really amounted to much thus far. But this tariff regime that's been in place against solar panel imports was troubling to the solar industry because having cheap solar panel imports was very helpful to them, to the overall solar industry. Obviously, it was kind of a problem for the individual solar panel producers. But for the solar industry as a whole in the United States, it was actually helpful. And so having them become more expensive is detrimental to the development of the solar industry in the U.S. And as I recall, the two firms, specific solar panel producing firms in the United States that had originally brought the complaint about Chinese dumping, were themselves actually owned by foreigners and were not really major producers in the United States. They were sort of peripheral, and they were not very competitive. So in a sense, this was sort of kind of market losers, so to speak, kind of begging for scraps, begging for a handout in a way. So that's relevant to the energy sector, to the kind of development of the renewable sector, in so much as it's specifically the solar side of the sector. Another story relevant to the energy sector, there's been a kind of shift back to nuclear power. Obviously, it became very unpopular after the Fukushima crisis. Fukushima crisis? I'm not sure how to pronounce that, actually. However you want to pronounce it. What was that, Neuro?
You have the green light to pronounce it however you want.
Okay.
I think that's about
so
right.
After that crisis, that became very unpopular, and there was a big movement to kind of move away from nuclear energy, especially in Japan and Germany. But Germany and Japan have kind of been returning to it a bit. Less so Germany. There's still a lot of pressure to move away from it in Germany. But in Japan, there's been a much stronger push back to nuclear. And effectively, they're kind of back on that path to trying to become more dependent on nuclear power, as opposed to other sources. They're still pushing renewables and whatnot, but they've kind of abandoned the agenda to just completely abandon nuclear power. So there was that. Oil production in Russia. This is not so much an individual specific item, but more just kind of a trend. Oil production in Russia has been becoming more inefficient over time. They kind of depended on Western investment from Western oil companies to update and upgrade the technology that they were using in their oil industry. And since those Western companies have been pushed out by a wave of nationalizations, some of which were politically motivated, some not, but that wave of nationalizations that occurred from 2000 to 2010, pretty much, I think is when it mostly happened. That pushed the Western companies out, and the technology has kind of atrophied a bit in Russia's oil sector. I'm sure they've made some improvements here and there, but in general, the efficiency and productivity of the sector has fallen with time, and production has kind of stalled out, and I think might be following. Might be wrong on that. If there are any Russians listening, please correct me on that. But oil production, which, again, you know, the Russian government in particular, if not the overall Russian economy, is disproportionately dependent on, is stagnating, and that's going to have long-term repercussions for the, again, the Russian economy and Russian budget. And then finally, I saw a story on garbage recycling in Ethiopia, which I thought was interesting. It's a new plant that was built in Ethiopia that's designed to basically incinerate garbage, I assume, just process it in a way that generates electricity, and it's supposed to generate some fairly large percentage of the nation's electricity needs. I was a bit surprised by the percentage they came up with. And that's good for the development of Ethiopia, for one, but I thought it was an interesting that garbage recycling could generate that much electricity. I hadn't been aware of that. So those are 4 snapshots, if you will, of energy sector stories. That's probably not what this person wanted, but that's about what I can come up with off the top of my head. I don't really have any like big insights into the energy sector and energy sector developments that I could get into, which is probably more what this person wanted. You know, I'm sorry I can't really kind of conjure anything right now, but off the top of my head, that's what I've got. What are your thoughts on China's One Belt, One Road, or CPEC, and the odds of success in stimulating the Chinese economy? I don't think it's going to stimulate the Chinese economy that much, because the Chinese economy is huge, and the amount of trade they're going to generate with these infrastructure projects outside of China is probably not going to be all that big. So I guess the short answer to the question would be that it's the odds of success in stimulating the Chinese economy are pretty slim. But I don't really think, that said, I don't think it was ever, these projects were ever really meant to stimulate economic development in China. I think they're more of a diplomatic tool. I think it's more to improve relations with countries outside of China, especially developing countries, and to engender good relations. I guess you could say that. Well, I guess that's the same thing as saying improving diplomatic ties, but also improve diplomatic ties and also create a vector of influence, a means by which China could influence those nations that are enjoying those projects. It's also a tool to kind of give an outlet for Chinese labor, because a lot of these projects involve importing labor from China instead of using local labor. And so that's a way to kind of deal with some of the labor surplus, although that surplus has been kind of dwindling over the past 10-15 years. And it's also a good source of revenue for Chinese firms, especially Chinese state-owned firms, which is particularly important given that they play a political role within China's political ecosystem. You know, I refer back to what I was saying before about China's political system being kind of a Hobbesian state. It's very cutthroat. The state-owned enterprises in China are among the premier political actors in that ecosystem. And, you know, Xi Jinping and his people in China have kind of been taming them over the past few years, kind of bringing them back under strict party control, rather than having them be kind of their own political entities. That's been one of the trends you've seen over the past few years, but they're still very important politically. And one of the problems they face is a lack of revenue, because they're not competitive and they're just kind of bad at what they do. So generating new revenue is important, and so having these overseas infrastructure projects serves as a revenue source to alleviate that difficulty. So the One Belt, One Road project is, I would say, more diplomatic and more political than it is economic. And I think it would be better to judge it on those merits. You know, I've seen people argue that, you know, the Chinese are wasting their money, they're never going to get paid back on all these loans they're giving out, it's going to be a big disaster. But I don't think that's true, because even if they do never get paid back, I don't think it's going to matter to them. They, you know, they may even just assume now that they're not going to get paid back, so I don't think it's necessarily a relevant consideration in their calculation. Let's see, what do you think about the idea that the average person who wants to become a politician or in any position of power is generally the wrong kind of person to have in that position? Yeah, that's insightful, actually. I think there's probably some merit to that. Generally the wrong guy. Yeah, it takes a certain amount of ego and self-regard to really think that you're kind of qualified to lead men, so to speak. To kind of run for a position of power and leadership. So I do think there's something to be said for that. I can't really offer any like data to back that up, though. So I can't get into like a deep quantitative academic analysis of how true that assessment is. But in general, I don't think it's a stretch or would be controversial to say that politicians in general have a reputation for being egotistical and self-centered. And I think that probably does represent a certain amount of self-selection among the population. You know, the people who are the most confident and in turn somewhat egotistical and most driven, most ambitious, you know, that sort of type A, ambitious, dominant personality is the most likely sort of personality to self-select itself out of the population into a position of political power. That in turn, by the way, is one of the criticisms you can make of closed political systems, including communism, fascism, etc. If you have a closed, narrow political system in which there is a dictatorship of the proletariat or dictatorship of a given political party or just any narrow group of people, that might work for a while. You might well have honest, earnest, ideological believers, true believers, leading your country for a while. But those people are inevitably going to be replaced by people who are self-interested, driven, ambitious, egotistical types of the sort we're talking about here. It's just inevitable that those are the people over the long term who rise to the top. They're attracted to power. And if you make the most powerful political position, or even just the most powerful position in general in a society, control of a given political group, then invariably that group is going to be dominated by borderline sociopaths, basically. Which I guess is kind of the gist of the question. So you might get some Mother Teresa dictator in the short run at the beginning when everybody is fired up and, really earnestly believing in the ideology that's leading your given political party that's trying to seize power, but those people are not going to last. You know, they're going to get phased out. And there's not really any good way to ensure otherwise. It's one of the best arguments for an open liberal democratic system. It focuses on limiting the power of the sociopaths in power, rather than giving them more power and hoping for the best. That in and of itself is kind of a matter of personal preference. Obviously, some people would prefer one rather than the other, depending on given circumstances or their personal preferences, but that is kind of the nature of the debate. That's the trade-off, if you will, between the two. Sortition. What do you think of sortition as a means of electing people to public office? I've never heard of sortition. Government sortition as a random sample from a larger pool of candidates. Okay. In governance, sortition selects political officials as a random sample from a larger pool of candidates. The logic behind the sortition process originates from the idea that power corrupts. That's a description I'm reading from the Wikipedia article. That's probably a really terrible idea. You would need to create a lot of restrictions in terms of a lot of restrictions on the power of political offices if you were going to do that, because it would be very easy to randomly select someone who just wants to go out of their way to completely wreck the system. Someone completely unfit for office, basically. You could have a lot of offices that have a very little power so that there's some offset. Basically, a given random sample of a population is more accurate the larger it is. So the larger your sample, the more representative it is. So if you're picking a very large random sample to fill a large number of political offices that will all have equal power and will offset each other, that could create a representative legislature, so to speak, which is more what I guess you would be building here. But if it were a very small sample, a very small number of seats rather, that would probably not be representative of the population. And certainly if you were just randomly selecting, say, a president, just one person, that would be very dangerous, I would think. That would be a very risky proposition. So I suppose you could design institutions of government such that you could do something like this, but it seems like it would be messy. Because one of the things that happens with having a larger number of people involved with governance, having a larger number of seats that would be more representative in a sortition system, well, in general, the more people you have negotiating, the more impossible negotiations become. You know, the more parties involved in the negotiation, the more different opposing viewpoints there are, the more horse trading has to happen in order to reach compromise, and in turn, the more difficult compromise is to be reached. And so in that sense, you know, having a very large representative legislature would have the benefit of accurately representing the overall population, but would have the downside of probably getting virtually nothing done. It would just be constant arguing and disputes, and it would just be very difficult to coordinate and organize people to fulfill any kind of legislative agenda. It's trade-offs. I mean, obviously, it would be some people prefer to have more representation in government and would be willing to trade off some government activity if they could have that. So it's a matter of personal preference in that regard, a trade-off. You know, people have to kind of make up their minds individually as to what they would prefer there. But in general, I think it would be pretty messy. That's my general impression of it. That's the last of the questions. Are we doing okay on time?
Yeah, we're a little over 7 hours in.
Okay.
So, for our session, that means what, another 40 minutes or so? 45. We could go a bit over depending on FuzzyChord and your availability. If we did like 8.5, that would be fine.
Oh, I'm very available.
All right.
Quite available. Let's see.
So, a little discussion in the chat. Occam's razor is the kind of mental trick of, generally speaking, the simplest explanation for the problem is the best. It's not always true, but it's a rule that helps people a lot of the time. And then Hitchens' razor is claims asserted without evidence can be dismissed without evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Which is one of his quotes. I hadn't heard it phrased as his razor, but that's cool.
I think those are both good cognitive tricks to use. Those are good points.
Mm-hmm.
Perfectly valid.
Credulity is part of the bias that causes us to fall into a lot of traps, where we tend to trust people. Based on a state of nature, it kind of makes sense to follow people's lead. If there's a bear charging out from the woods and someone says, run over here to this hut, generally it's better to just go with it than it is to be like, is that really the best place for us to go right now? If you're having a discussion like this or trying to measure the outcomes, you're dead. So being able to realize our 21st century kind of station and how we can think about things in a more intelligent way than nature kind of made for us.
Well, I have some interesting, I guess this is kind of trivia almost, but I thought it was an interesting news item. China is starting to invite officers from Latin America to China for their training and education, all expenses paid. And the reason that's interesting is because the United States does something very similar and has done something similar for the past half century or so. It invites officers from foreign militaries into the United States for training and education. And that's partly done to improve the quality of the officers in allied military. But it's also done to create networks. Basically, well, not only to create networks, but also to kind of expose people to the American political system, American way of life, etc. And to try to create a positive impression in that vein. But more importantly, it creates networks. You know, it creates connections between U.S. military and government officials and officers from these foreign militaries who may move on to higher positions within their respective militaries or move into positions of government later. So that gives the United States a kind of vector of influence into those countries. So China, by doing this, is doing something similar. It's kind of laying the groundwork to create vectors of influence into Latin American governments and political systems. The personal connections these officers make in China could be used later by the Chinese government or the Chinese military in order to exert some kind of influence, depending on political developments and circumstances. So an example of China kind of building its architecture of influence, building its capacity to influence other countries outside China. There was a famous case, there was a famous school in the United States that was called the School of the Americas. That's particularly infamous in the United States now. A number of people who would go on to become dictators, some of them rather brutal dictators, received training at the School of the Americas. And so it's kind of got a reputation as being a kind of university for despotism, so to speak. And people on the left in particular in the United States hated it and constantly complained about it until it was finally, I think, shut down in the 1990s. I don't know if China is setting up something quite like the School of the Americas in that regard. And to be fair, I don't know that the School of Americas was a CIA dictator workshop. That might be unfair, because I understand the counter-argument there was that the School of the Americas was just purely officer training, that there was nothing untoward happening there, and that the fact that a number of people trained there went on to become dictators was coincidence. The degree to which you believe that is, of course, up to the individual and up to individual discretion. It just depends on your own personal interpretation of the available evidence. And of course, the evidence is relatively narrow. There's not a lot of information about the School of the Americas and whatnot. At least not that I know about. I could be wrong. I would, maybe somebody in chat knows more, could kind of elaborate on that. But I thought that was an interesting sign of the times, that China was making that move. Yeah, China's been pretty active in Latin America in general. Nothing really explicit, but they have been building relations there, in particular with the ALBA countries. That's the ALBA countries is basically an alliance of Chavista governments in Latin America. It incorporates Cuba, Venezuela, Ecuador, Bolivia. I think technically also a couple Caribbean island nations, but I suspect they're more in it for the money than anything else. Venezuela used to have quite a bit of oil money to spare, and so there was a couple of nations that kind of joined just to kind of get some of the oil money, whichever the Venezuelans were willing to part with. Oh, I think technically Guyana also is in there. People tend to forget about them. But China has been building relations in particular with Venezuela and to a lesser degree Ecuador and Cuba. Yeah, China is not particularly interested in bailing out the Venezuelan government. They don't really see them as like a natural ally, just because they're both kind of socialist countries. But they are kind of trying to build a positive relationship there. Partly so that they can secure a source of oil, but also so that they could possibly in future kind of use that relationship against U.S. and U.S. interests in the region. Not quite at the point where they could do that right now, because the relationship is very limited right now, and the Chinese are probably wary about deepening it too much, especially when the Venezuelan government is not particularly inspiring confidence in people that it is able to really govern effectively. It's all good and well to build an alliance with another country of similar values, but if it's a failed state, then it doesn't really present a lot of value to you. Ecuador would probably be more promising in that regard. Russia does something similar. They've got a number of defense agreements with Venezuela and has been trying to kind of help more directly with the Venezuelan crisis. They've actually given them an infusion of cash, I think something like $1 billion or $2 billion in loans. And I think in exchange they got shares in the Venezuelan energy sector, specifically the state-owned oil company. But I don't know that they've been able to go much beyond that. There was some talk a while back about Russia maybe having some military forces there or something to that effect, but I don't think that ever went anywhere. Which is probably for the best. One of the reasons the United States really has not been active in Latin American affairs over the past 20 years is because the Cold War ended. For people with long memories, or who have read about the subject, the United States was more than a little bit intrusive into Latin American politics during the Cold War. And so the end of the Cold War kind of gave a breath of fresh air to Latin American relations and internal politics. And that was kind of mutual, too. The United States did not particularly relish propping up various right-wing dictators. That was kind of seen as a necessary evil on the parts of the corresponding decision-makers within the U.S. government. So everybody was pretty happy with the de-escalation and tensions, Cold War tensions, and the corresponding relaxation and paranoia on the part of the U.S. government and right-wing allies in Latin America. But if Venezuela or some other like-minded country were to invite a foreign military, especially one outside the Americas, into their own country, into Venezuela or Ecuador or Cuba, that might precipitate a resummation of American influence in the region. That would probably not have a particularly stabilizing effect for the region, certainly not for relations between the U.S. and that country. So I suspect that any effort by China or Russia to really gain a military presence in the Western Hemisphere would probably be met with extreme wariness on the part of Latin American countries for that reason, because that would probably engender a strong American response. But influence peddling is fine. If you want to give a couple $1 billion to Venezuela or build an economic relationship or what have you, I don't think the U.S. government would see that as sufficiently threatening to take a very hostile stance towards a country like Venezuela or Cuba or etc. Some tensions, yes, there's already been some pressure brought on Venezuela by Washington, but I don't think they'll go much beyond that. I really don't think Venezuela is a real priority for Washington. And I'm always surprised when I read about it. I think that's done more for domestic reasons than it is for domestic political considerations than for any, and it does signify any real shift in American foreign policy. Let's see, we got another question. Do you have any thoughts on the effects of social media and the internet more generally on society recently, and what can we do to avoid the negative side? Yeah, social media has been getting a lot of attention, specifically social media companies. They've been really facing a lot of pressure from governments, especially Theresa May's government in Britain for some reason. Don't know why she made that a priority, but there's been a lot more pressure in general around the world on social media companies to try to crack down on extremist content or radical content or otherwise just content that would be considered distasteful or if not illegal in other forms of media.
One thing that comes up as a topic with social media is the metrics. So how many likes or views you get on your content or comments or whatever for Facebook. And you have people who aren't even like personalities or whatever who kind of place tons of stake in how much attention they're getting online. And it's really changed the way that people decide, am I a good person? Am I likable? Am I as popular as I need to be? And you have a lot of these false numbers where people are buying likes and what have you on Twitter to be even more visible. And it creates this very strange kind of modern illusion of what the ideal person looks like. What should you look like? How fit should you be? What kind of activities should you do? And a lot of people are feeling really bad about themselves because the people who are hyper successful on some front get the most visibility. So that kind of sets the tone for where you feel you should be. Oh, this person just did these things. I haven't done shit. Well, now I feel bad about myself. But if you had more of an old school approach to media, maybe you read the newspaper, but you're not getting a sense of the best, the brightest, the most fit and beautiful and all this. It's very overwhelming for our kind of tribal mindset, really. That's where we came from, is a tribe was the social unit for the vast majority of human history and prehistory. And now we have the entire world can be on the same platform. Like, people of every country can be on Instagram except North Korea. Maybe there's a North Korean Instagram user, but that's kind of the idea of we have a very unrealistic standard for what the average person is like now. That's stressful.
Yeah, that's kind of a ongoing development. You know, as society, as mass media has evolved, it's brought us closer together. It's kind of destroyed time and space and created sort of larger and larger communities, which has resulted in the proliferation of common standards of, say, beauty or, you know, other social norms. There's been more uniformity and more kind of a uniform, kind of a conforming effect, so to speak, on from mass media. And social media is sort of the latest and greatest manifestation of that. It's brought so many people from so many different places together into kind of one community or a series of different that it's creating a lot of tensions, unsurprisingly, because it's just human nature to kind of interact with people and try to judge yourself according to how they think of you, or etc. And with so many people to judge yourself against, the standard by which you judge good person or attractive person or what have you, that's much higher than it used to be on account of that. I might add that one of the effects of social media has kind of been to take us back to the past, which is to say that it's actually somewhat reversed mass media in a way. Because it used to be that there were very few sources of mass media. It was magazines, newspapers, etc. There was only a few television stations back in the 1950s. You know, it was a very sort of small set of outlets through which you could get national media. And that sort of enhanced the conforming effect of mass media. It created sort of it helped create a single culture. It's one of the reasons that languages disappeared. You know, there's kind of a common uniform accent in the United States now, whereas there used to be a lot more diversity in accents. That's partly the result of mass media. Also, France pushed its sort of standard form of French using mass media. It used to be there were a lot more dialects of French. I think I remember reading somewhere, and maybe somebody from France listening can kind of correct me on this if I'm wrong, but I think I remember reading somewhere that as late as the 1950s, something like half of the French population spoke a dialect of French, but not the standard type of French as their home language. Whereas now it's almost exclusively, you know, standard French. Mass media basically is like the principal culprit there, and the principal tool by which that has changed. Behind that change, those kinds of changes, it's not just in France and the U.S. that they've happened. But since then, the explosion of the internet and social media has served to allow the creation of niche communities. You know, there's not one source you can get your information from. So because there's a lot more outlets, it's possible to create a bubble of confirmation bias, basically, or to kind of find a subgroup, a niche group, that you can kind of encompass yourself in, that you can envelop yourself in, and kind of have that be your culture. So even if there's no one space, physical space, that you all kind of come together and meet and measure yourselves by, and, you know, compare yourselves and create common group norms, you have that space online by which you can do that. So in a sense, the emergence of social media has removed the spatial element of cultural dynamism, the creation of new cultures, cultural niches, etc. Used to have a strong spatial element. Now that's been completely destroyed, and you can kind of be whatever you want. It used to be similar before mass media. You know, you would have small groups that would emerge in given cities, or given neighborhoods of a city, or in given parts of a state, etc. In specific areas, you would see specific subcultures emerge. But you didn't generally see them necessarily spread much beyond those given areas. If they did spread beyond those given areas, then it just became culture. It became regional culture or even national culture. But if it just stayed in one place, it was generally limited by space. Now it's not limited by space. You know, any given kind of culture can find a space online and then attract members and then build from there. So the destruction of space as being relevant to the development of culture, you could call that an implication of social media. There's also political effects, because obviously the way we have discourse politically has been largely defined by internet. Was largely on the internet, I should say. Political discourse is largely on the internet now. And so the ease with which it is to impersonate people, or to create propaganda or agitprop, like what we were talking about earlier, that's in turn acted as a new force in political discourse that we don't really quite know the effects of yet, and don't really quite know how to handle yet. And then there's also national security issues, and that ties into the radicalization debate. You know, to what degree are people being radicalized on the internet? Can we even say that they're being radicalized on the internet? Could it be that they would have been radicalized anyway? That there are some people just innately prone to extremist views and who kind of just gravitate to them naturally. And the internet just kind of acts as one vector by which they do that, replacing previous vectors by which they would have done it anyway. That's a debate. But it's also a pertinent debate, and it's definitely, I think, uncontroversial to say that social media plays an important role in radicalization as it's occurring now in the modern era, even if it isn't necessarily the root cause of it. So those are all thoughts on the effects of social media. And I thank Neuro there for getting me started on that, because I wasn't really sure where to go with that. It kind of primed my pump, so to speak.
Word for the wise. You can get some pretty dense bad news on Facebook and other social media platforms too, so in all things practice moderation, especially in the way they use social media. It does create a lot of positive feedback loops for us in terms of serotonin and dopamine, where a lot of our brain drugs are activated by seeing other people's faces and connecting with the drama and the news and all that. And it can be a very kind of extreme experience if you're scrolling through and everything that is the most exciting filters to the top. So take your breaks as you need them.
Yeah.
Go outside, listen to the birds, watch the clouds or something for 5 minutes.
Yeah, it's easy to get the impression that the world is spiraling out of control and that it's a hyper-violent place. But that's, like Neuro says, that's just filtering. Actually, the world is getting more peaceful and is improving over time. That's a discussion we've had. And so it's important to kind of keep that in mind, keep your perspective. It's not that the world is getting worse, it's that you're hearing more about the bad things that have been already happening, and have probably always been happening. So, let's see. What can we do to avoid the negative side? Yeah, like Neuro said. Actually, yeah, that's what you were addressing, that specific part of the question. I would agree with Neuro there, yeah, just kind of take your breaks and, you know, maintain perspective. Let's see, last week I believe an Israeli F-16 was downed by Iranian forces. What are the potential implications of this? Is the region escalating even more than it already is? I don't really think it's escalating. I think the region is just kind of trending. It's, I actually kind of talk about this in the podcast that I've nominally started. I know I haven't put any new episodes up. I'm working on it. Really, I'm doing a lot of research right now, so it's definitely in the pipe, but it's just not quite ready yet. But the first podcast series I did was on Syria, and so I kind of talked about some of the dynamics and the diplomacy of the region. And so what's going on in the region mostly is the Syrian conflict, especially with regard to the F-16 being shot down. The Israelis are concerned about the Iranians gaining some kind of permanent presence in Syria. They really don't want that, because they're concerned that it'll act as a sort of springboard for the projection of Iranian power, if not into Lebanon and Syria, then possibly even Israel. So there was an Iranian drone that flew into, well, the Israelis say it was an Iranian drone, make of that what you will, but the Israelis claim that an Iranian drone flew into their airspace and they shot it down, and there was a series of airstrikes that were launched in retaliation. And that's a pretty strong response to something as relatively mild as a drone violating your airspace, but it speaks to the degree of concern the Israeli government has to the Iranian presence in Syria, and the seriousness with which they treat that. So they had a show of force, basically, to kind of show that this would not be tolerated, specifically drones violating Israeli airspace, but also to signal their strong opposition to Iran's presence and influence in Syria. And there was an Israeli F-16 shot down during that wave of airstrikes, and the Israelis immediately, it may have been that they responded immediately with another volley of airstrikes. It may be that they already had those planned. I can't really tell. But certainly by having another volley of airstrikes after that F-16 was shot down, they basically showed that they would not be deterred from such airstrikes as a retaliatory measure in future by Syria's air defenses. In other words, they wouldn't be put off by Syria's shooting down an F-16. They're going to keep on going and launching airstrikes as they see fit. I don't think there's any substantive implications beyond that, because I don't think the Israelis are signaling that they really want to get deeply involved in Syria. They're just kind of signaling that they don't like Iran being there and that they're going to take action if Iran uses its presence there against Israel or Israeli interests. As for the IS, or not the IS, but as for the region escalating more, I don't think the Iranians are going to escalate beyond that. And actually, the Israeli government was pretty quick to say, we're not interested in escalating this, we're just sending a signal. And I think Netanyahu, Prime Minister of Israel, Netanyahu specifically went out of his way to basically say that. And the Iranians basically denied that it was their drone. They just said that, you know, we condemn the Israeli airstrikes, but we totally didn't send a drone into your territory. Which is not the kind of rhetoric you would make if you really wanted to escalate things. If you wanted to escalate things, you would say, oh, that definitely was our drone, and we're very upset that you shot it down. That was very unreasonable, and the airstrikes were even worse. The Iranians haven't done that, so it seems like Israel and Iran are not really interested in going anywhere with this. It's just basically an exchange of signals, Middle East style. Diplomatic signaling in the Middle East is, unfortunately, rather violent, and tends to be very dramatic. It's sort of the state of play, as you will, sort of the state of international discourse in the region. So I wouldn't worry about it. Short answer, don't worry about it. It's just normal diplomacy. I don't think it'll escalate beyond that. And it may be that the circumstances within the overarching Syrian conflict change, that either Iran or Israel becomes more deeply involved and starts taking more action. But I don't think that's going to be because an F-16 gets shot down or because an Iranian drone gets caught in Israeli airspace. That's going to have to do with other factors endogenous to the Syrian conflict and actions by other actors involved with it. And again, if you're interested in the Syrian conflict, I encourage you to go check out the podcast. It's not a great podcast. It's my first attempt at it. this episode on Syria, so I am looking for feedback on that, by the way. So if anybody is interested, give it a try, and please tell me how bad it is and how I can do better in future. Let's see, and a follow-up question, do you have any thoughts on the psychological effects of spending lots of time online, for example, with regard to instant gratification? I don't necessarily have a lot of thoughts, but I have a hell of a lot of experience. Yeah, it's very easy to kind of get hung up on it. Hung up on the internet and time online and online gaming, and I don't know if I have a gaming addiction or if gaming addiction is a thing, because there is kind of a debate about gaming addiction, but I do think I am one of those people that make psychologists suspect that it might be.
Well, the thing with addiction, and we've had to define this term when we discuss it a lot, is an addiction is something which impacts your life in a negative fashion. It's not just a hobby or something that occupies a lot of your time and energy. It's specifically one that negatively impacts other areas of your life. So if you're playing video games to the point where maybe you're skipping classes and failing your classes, or it's impacting your relationships in a negative way, then that's an addiction. If you're playing a lot, I mean, that's a hobby, that's something that you're excited about. So it kind of depends.
Yeah, and you could extrapolate that too to just general time online. I mean, the same logic pretty much applies. And I don't know enough about specifically the effects of spending lots of time online to know enough to kind of add color to that assessment. Neuro here, you could probably add a lot more, you know, kind of more familiar with cognitive science than I am, and that's probably more the relevant field there.
Yeah, there's psychological addiction with games, but it's not the same as a physiological dependency, where if you don't have video games, then you'll have intense headaches and start foaming at the mouth and be unable to sleep and whatnot. Some people will joke about that, like, I haven't played World of Warcraft in a week, I'm dying. You'll be fine. You're not physically dependent upon it, but maybe you would prefer doing that over other things. It's not really surprising, that's kind of how most games are designed nowadays. How can we get our players to continue to invest time and energy and money into our game?
I do know that there is in China and South Korea, I think it's South Korea, certainly in China, a restriction on the number of consecutive hours that you can play online. And I don't know if that's online in general or just a specific game, but they do try to kind of curtail that, because there have been stories about people gaming themselves to death, basically. You know, somebody playing StarCraft for 48 hours straight and then keeling over dead, that kind of thing. So the government wanted to, quote-unquote, protect the youth and passed a bunch of restrictions on the amount of time you could be online. I think that's just for kids, though. I don't know. Well, in China, I think it's everybody. But in South Korea, I think it's more specifically restrictions on children.
It's kind of like hearing about a kid die at a rave. So I've been to a few raves. It was never like a thing that I did all the time, but every once in a while there would be a kid who would die, and then the news cries foul of, oh, these raves are dangerous experiences and they're giving these kids drugs. Basically what's happening in these scenarios is you get a bunch of kids who are all hyped up, they're dancing together for like 5 to 6 hours at a time, and some of them just won't drink water and they can die of dehydration. That's usually what the problem is, because they're getting a lot of positive feedback of having music they enjoy, hanging out with people they like, and then some of them are on drugs that make them feel good, and they forget about their basic survival upkeep of, I need to be hydrated, otherwise bad things are going to happen. So with gaming, I would say it's probably a similar thing. These kids who are gaming for days in a row are likely not taking care of their physiological needs, and then they're falling by the wayside. But it's not specifically the experiences in the game that are killing them. Maybe for certain games. I keep losing to Terran in StarCraft. It's impacting my health.
Let's see here. What do you think of the recent Russian-Syrian attack on U.S. proxy forces and the U.S. providing air support, killing hundreds of Syrian/Russian soldiers? Does this open the door to greater American intervention in the region? I actually don't think it does. And the reason I don't think it does is because I think it more reflects the current level of American intervention. This is more just what the United States has already been doing for probably about a year or so now, which is providing support to the YPG, to Kurdish militia forces in territory they control east of the Euphrates River. I mean, if you don't know, and you can actually see this really easily looking at a map, the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, which is sort of the umbrella organization that the United States supports, through which the United States supports Kurdish militias in Syria, controls Syrian territory east of the Euphrates River. And that was an agreement explicitly made between the United States and the Syrian government, basically, more accurately, Russia, Iran, etc., as far as where combat operations against the Islamic State would occur, and which side would be responsible for clearing out the Islamic State where. So the Kurds would clear out the Islamic State east of the Euphrates River, and then the Syrian government and its allies would clear them out west of the river. And as a result, the SDF now controls basically that eastern chunk of Syria. But the United States has always committed itself to defending the YPG and the SDF, not only against the Islamic State, in order to assist them in that battle, but also against anyone else who attacks them. It's very sensitive about that point. It was a little unclear for a long time about the extent to which the American commitment to the SDF extended to protecting them against the Syrian government or Iran or what have you. But for a long time it didn't matter because everybody was just narrowly focused on the Islamic State. And over the past month and a half or so, the United States has come out pretty strongly in its commitment and has basically asserted that it is going to commit to defend the SDF against the Syrian government if necessary. I think part of that deal, though, is that the Syrian government, the United States government, is not going to commit to help the SDF expand its territory. It's not going to help them kind of fight the Syrian government and take over Syria. It's just going to kind of sit on that territory and I think use it as leverage in negotiations with the Syrian government. And I talk a bit about that in the podcast, and I probably can't remember as much off the top of my head as I can as I said there, but basically there's going to be negotiations at some point about the future of Syria. And if the United States had pulled support from the Kurds, they probably would have been eaten up by the Turks and their rebel allies and the Syrian government and their allies. And then the negotiations would have kind of centered around probably, they would have resulted probably in a stronger Iranian presence in the country than the United States would have liked. So I suspect in order to mitigate Iran's presence in the country, principally that, they're going to try to use the Kurds as a negotiating chip in negotiations. They're going to use the fact that they control a good chunk of territory and that nobody else can beat them so long as they have American support to try to get concessions from the Iranians, the Russians, and Damascus. But I don't think that's going to entail an escalation. It's only going to entail an escalation if the other people, if Russia, Damascus, or Iran initiates an escalation, if they try to attack the YPG or otherwise try to undermine them. Only then, I think, would there be an American, in turn, escalation of American attacks in retaliation. The Turks obviously represent a unique difficulty, because the Turkish government is pretty hell-bent on not allowing an independent Kurdish state or even an autonomous Kurdish state emerge in Syria. So they've been pretty hell-bent on pressuring the United States to end support to the Kurds. But the United States has made it pretty clear that's not going to happen, since the Kurds are the principal manifestation of American influence in Syria and the only real negotiating chip they have to work with. So the Turkish government being upset about that because they see the YPG as linked to a terrorist organization in Turkey called the PKK, they're pushing really hard, not just diplomatically, but also militarily. They've actually started attacking a enclave of Kurdish territory around the city of Afrin in northern Syria. You might have seen it in the news a bit. And they're pretty much specifically attacking that enclave to put pressure on the Kurds and by extension the Americans, trying to get them to give concessions on concessions on support for Kurds and the Kurdish ambitions. Thus far, the United States has not been responsive to that, so I don't think it's going to go anywhere. And the Turkish offensive itself hasn't really made a lot of ground. They are advancing, but it's been pretty slow, and I don't know that they're going to keep it up perpetually. It may not be worth it in the long run if they can't get any concessions from the United States. And the Turks, for their part, it's also important to mention, also threatened Manbij, which is a section of territory west of the Euphrates River. And the Kurds kind of upset everybody by occupying Manbij. They originally took it from the Islamic State, which everybody was kind of okay with, but part of the agreement made had been that the Kurds would stay east of the Euphrates River, and that everything west would be either Syrian government or Turkish-influenced, Turkish-controlled. But the Kurds did not retreat from Manbij after they took it from the Islamic State, and they decided to keep it. And the United States was not particularly happy with that. We very politely asked them not to do that, but we weren't really in a position to force them to. Well, I guess we could have forced them to if we'd strong-armed them, but we weren't really willing to endanger the relationship. We valued the relationship more than we valued the limited degree of cooperation the United States was getting from the Turks. And so we basically just agreed to let them have it. And when the Turks started putting pressure on them and threatening to invade, the United States actually sent special forces in to basically just be present and to act as a kind of human shield, if you will. You know, if the Turks attacked, they might risk killing some American personnel, and then, well, that would be a huge shitstorm. That would be a huge shitstorm. So that was an effective deterrent, and it's a deterrent that has been maintained in place. There are still American personnel in Manbij, deterring the Turks from attacking there. So even though the Turks have threatened Afrin and Manbij, and have actually invaded Afrin, they have not invaded Manbij, and are not probably likely to do so. So more likely we're going to see some violence, but on a low level. There might be some poking and prodding. I think the Syrian attack across the Euphrates River that resulted in the American airstrike that you reference in this question, that was more of a poke. They were kind of testing American resolve, I suspect, more than they were actually trying to seize any territory. And I might add that it was not really Russian personnel per se that were involved in that. That was actually Russian mercenaries. If it had been actual Russian personnel, the Russian government probably would have been much more vocal in condemning it. But because it was just Russian mercenaries, the Russian government was pretty quiet afterward. It wasn't really considered as much of an affront as if the United States, as it would have been if the United States had actually killed actual serving Russian servicemen. So, in short answer, I wouldn't worry about it. Keep an eye on it. Keep an eye on the region in general. But I don't think that particular incident is a harbinger of greater similar such incidents in the region. Let's see, how are we doing?
We're good on time as long as FuzzyChord's good for it.
Oh, right.
If he needs to go, then we can talk about other topics. I feel like we would not struggle to come up with something to talk about.
Oh, no, for sure. Yeah, I'm just used to working with that fixed time frame, so I keep thinking of it. Yeah, no problem. Yeah, just let us know, FuzzyChord, anytime you're ready. So something else we could talk about, and well, I guess this isn't a topic per se, but it's more just an event that happened. The Trump administration is threatening tariffs on aluminum and steel. And it's a little bit ambiguous as to whether that's going to be a tariff on all steel and aluminum imports, or if it's going to specifically target China, which is pretty much the source of the problem. We talked a bit about steel tariffs earlier. This is kind of this is sort of a continuation of that. There have been lots of complaints over the past few years, not only in the U.S. but around the world, about steel dumping by China, and that kind of has to do with China's attempt to stimulate its economy after 2008. They really heavily invested in steel production capacity in order to kind of generate jobs and in order to make steel cheaper for other industries and in order to stimulate them. But a lot of that lending was done by state-owned enterprises, and so there's a strong belief, basically, that the government pressured state-owned enterprises to lend money that they would not otherwise have lent to firms setting up steel plants. The result being in a distortion of the economy, such that there's a lot more steel production in China that their economy would otherwise warrant. The result being that a huge amount of surplus steel that China cannot consume is being dumped onto the market and is negatively impacting producers in other countries. That's sort of dumping in a nutshell. So apparently something similar is happening with aluminum. I haven't read as much about that, so I'm a little hesitant to commit on that. But aluminum is the other problem area there. They're also being accused of dumping aluminum. And what I thought was interesting about this story, beyond just the normal being part of the narrative about Trump economic nationalism, was the fact that China did threaten to retaliate, which they haven't really done up till now. They've made some noises about it here and there, but they pretty explicitly threatened to retaliate on this measure. And their argument in particular was that the U.S. steel industry was already pretty heavily protected. The United States has already implemented some punitive tariffs in order to protect the steel industry. So the Chinese are not at all happy about being threatened with further steel tariffs and are threatening to retaliate. Whether they'll retaliate with steel tariffs of their own or tariffs in general, across the board, or targeted tariffs like strategic tariffs, like what we were talking about before, they haven't really made that clear. The threat right now is still ambiguous, but it could portend an escalation. That could portend a sort of a tit for tat in tariffs. That's unlikely. I think that's an extreme example on the far end of the spectrum, but it's possible, depending on how the Trump administration handles it. It wouldn't be a consideration at all if the Trump administration were not quite so known for the grace and humility with which they handle political issues of this variety. Let's see. So we already talked about that. We already talked about, yeah. So this will be a test to see how seriously the Chinese kind of treat this issue. And kind of a litmus test, so to speak, of how they're going. Well, a precedent will be set regarding how they'll probably approach similar issues in future. They could start escalating more and more as more, Trump-style economic nationalist tariffs are put in place. On the other hand, they could just kind of roll with it. And it's quite possible that they would just roll with it. Because unless the Trump administration really goes all out with economic nationalism and a protectionist regime, the Chinese government would probably be willing to sacrifice a few tariffs here and there in order to maintain the overarching liberal trade regime and overarching good relations with the United States. They probably assumed they would have to do something like that as soon as Trump was elected. That's not necessarily a big problem. It just depends on how far things go, basically. Let's see. A couple more questions. What's your favorite fiction book? I really haven't read much fiction, honestly. And I wish I keep saying I will and that I want to, but I never really seem to get around to it. I was in I was basically in college for almost a decade, working on the bachelor's degree and the master's degrees and etc. So most of the books I've read have been non-fiction, very hard, explicit non-fiction. So I haven't really had a lot of opportunity. I can't even say I have a favorite, really, because none of them have really stuck out.
I would recommend Tolkien for you, just because you appreciate depth quite a bit, and his books, they have history and they have mythology behind the history, so he kind of doesn't really leave that many gaps in terms of creating the languages, creating the societies and the species, and the creation of the species at the beginning of the world, and the angels and the pantheon and all that shit. So it's pretty nice if you want something that you can kind of chew on for years, as opposed to a quick book here or there. I do
remember reading, oh sorry, go ahead.
I read Tolkien stuff, the Lord of the Rings books and The Hobbit when I was a teenager, and then as an adult read through them again, and the Silmarillion as well, which is the chronicling of the history of the elves and men before the events of The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. And that one was really fun to read as an adult, but as a kid I couldn't finish it. It was too slow. Because it has a lot more... It's written more like a history book rather than as an adventure story, as the other ones are.
I think I'm more familiar with Lord of the Rings just because of the movies. But I haven't actually seen the Hobbit movies yet, so I'm not as familiar with that.
Oh, you didn't miss too much there.
That's kind of what I heard.
The Hobbit movies are quite different from the books, or the book itself. The Hobbit book is a journey where it's a set of characters that have a starting point, and they travel along a path and they reach the end point. And it's kind of a whimsical adventure is the tone of the book, but the movies, they kind of tried to make it into an epic when it wasn't written like an epic. So it feels kind of like they almost forced it to be more like Lord of the Rings than it was intended to be. The Hobbit is more kind of kid-friendly, where it's funny, it's not quite as dark. There are some dark elements, but
Yeah.
they added a bunch of Hollywood stuff to the Hobbit movies as well. The first Hobbit movie is good. I would recommend that one. They didn't alter that one too much. But the second and third one, they added some stuff that wasn't even in the original books.
Well, leave it to Hollywood to embellish.
There isn't a romance in The Hobbit, so they added one.
God.
They added an elven character who has the hots for one of the dwarf guys. And it's like, okay.
Wow.
And they made it into a love triangle thing too. People were pissed.
I can imagine.
Yeah.
Yeah, me and my armchair general friends in high school used to kind of complain about that. You know, we liked war movies, but a lot of movies with a lot of action and war elements had these sort of random romances shoehorned in for no apparent reason. I remember there was a movie about Vasily Zaitsev, the Soviet sniper, and I don't remember what the movie was called. It was way back when. Not exactly the best representation of the Eastern Front you'll see, but it's at least a fun movie. But, you know, it's a movie about the Battle of Stalingrad and snipers, and then there's just sort of this random romance with the nurse. It's very sort of disorienting. It's not what you would associate with the Battle of Stalingrad. Let's see. I did read a book called The Forever War, which I think was oh no, it's not a Heinlein book, but yeah, it's a really good book, that science fiction book that takes a look at sort of just comments on war, the nature of being in an extended war, and how wars can drag out, and the effect that wars that drag out have on society writ large. And it also comments on the cultural disorientation that comes with serving in the military a long time. You know, if you serve in the military a long time, I don't know this personally, this is just what I've read. Somebody who knows better, please comment. But from what I've read, if you serve in the military a long time, it can be very disorienting to come back home after being deployed for an extended period. A lot of the culture actually changes while you're gone, and it can seem very alien and unfamiliar. And it can be very just weird and disjointing and jolting, jarring, basically. And so this book really captures that. And yeah, I thought it was a good look at sort of the human side of being a soldier. They're very, very insightful in that regard, as well as just social change in general. That was also an important part of the book. And then I also liked, I don't even know that I would consider this a good book, but there was a book that was part of, I think, it's the same guy who wrote the Honor Carrington series, I think. Don't quote me on that. And I can't even really honestly remember what the book was called. It was like a standalone book, basically, from the series. And it was about like a huge war between like the human race and some other, like an allied lion race. It was sort of some wing commander type stuff. And they fought like a bug race, of course, naturally. And, it's all kind of very cheesy in that way. But the thing I really liked about it was the degree of real... It sounds funny now that I say it. The degree of realism in the book that... of the actual fighting, the actual military operations. There's a lot of science fiction that takes place in space that involves military affairs like wars and what have you. That is basically World War II in space. There's dogfights and there's carriers and, all that kind of thing. All that basically just a carbon copy of World War II style fighting. But this book that I read actually portrayed warfare in space basically predicating it, modeling it, if you will, on modern technology. So long-range standoff missiles, large capital ships that kind of have to spread out, actual creative use of fighters, space fighter aircraft, spacecraft in this case. It was just a more realistic take on what space warfare would look like. Not necessarily the most realistic, but a lot more realistic than say, Star Wars or some equivalent. So I liked it just for that, because I was a hardware guy as a kid, so I really liked, vehicles and that kind of thing, and I was always a little bit curious why science fiction stories never portrayed war using modern technology. Like, why would you have these big giant capital ships kind of broadsiding each other with guns, when in the modern warfare it would be, you just use missiles. Why not just use a long-range missile and blow the shit out of it? Star Destroyers don't do that. It's basically just a giant space galleon. It's a very imposing space galleon, but not necessarily a very practical one.
Why do you hate space wizards?
Oh, hey, space wizards are great, don't get me wrong.
Star Wars.
I was a big Star Wars fan as a kid. I just kind of grew out of it after a while.
What do you think did you see the new movie?
I haven't seen it yet, actually. I'm not quite there yet.
Which of the Disney ones have you seen?
I saw the first one.
Force Awakens, okay.
Yeah, that's the one. I've seen that. I haven't seen, basically that's the only one. I haven't seen the Rogue Squadron one yet.
Rogue One is the best Star Wars movie ever. In my opinion. It doesn't have lightsabers, except for one Darth Vader scene. But it's very streamlined and efficient. The characters are cool. I really like Rogue One. I think it's Empire Strikes Back is the one most people say is their favorite, but I think Rogue One gives it a run for its money. Donnie Yen.
Obviously, Return of the Jedi is the best.
Okay. So I heard you like Ewoks. The Last Jedi,
everybody bitches about the Ewoks.
The Last Jedi is pretty good. I wasn't super excited about it. Like, I thought it was good. It was definitely like a new Star Wars movie, and it didn't feel like it was bad or anything. But it didn't really get me super hyped.
Gotcha.
There was a lot going on, and it kind of felt like you're rushed from one ridiculous thing happening to the next ridiculous thing. And I think a little bit of lore goes a long way.
Yeah.
A fictional universe where you just have a conversation where maybe shit is not actively blowing up right now. That can be good.
Yeah. Yeah, a little bit of expository dialogue or some background or just some context. Very useful in that regard, I would agree. It's one of the things I liked about the expanded universe. The Star Wars expanded universe. Which, alas, was obliterated by Disney. I know not why. I grew up with that. I grew up reading Star Wars novels when I was a kid, and so that expanded universe was very familiar. And I was very surprised to hear that Disney just kind of abandoned it. They're sort of starting over and replacing it with their own universe, which makes sense.
We decide what's canon.
Well, pretty much. But, that's fair, because the expanded universe was huge. There was so much material and media. It would have just been a continuity nightmare to try to navigate it all and try to create a movie that was that fit into it. Just way easier to just create something new. So I totally get that. But still a bit disappointing. It's not going to be there in the future. And I guess that's just the nature of things.
The Old Republic stuff at all?
I never did. I was always expanded universe, but after the Battle of Yavin, or after the Battle of Endor, rather. Didn't really get into the stuff before, and that was kind of after my time anyway. I was already kind of getting into other things by then.
Yeah, that was more my jam. I played the Knights of the Old Republic games and Star Wars Old Republic, the MMO. And both of those, it felt more fun to kind of be a Jedi and a Sith because they were both in really large numbers. At that time, that's kind of like the peak of Force users just all over the place. Lightsabers everywhere. Did you get your lightsaber? Everyone gets a lightsaber. That's fun. The Republic is strong and it's a stable kind of democratic government organization, but the Sith are also doing their thing on their fun planets.
Yeah, I remember you guys playing that a lot back in the day.
Yeah, he was a Jedi Consular, which was like Qui-Gon Jinn, Yoda kind of character. And I usually played a Shadow, which is like Darth Maul.
Yeah. That was back when you guys made those YouTube videos, wasn't it?
Yep. The oatmeal one is still a command on the channel. I feel like the relevance of oatmeal is always there. I have it pretty much every morning. I kind of talk with some viewers about superpowers and how I'm just a person, but I think one of my amazing skills that helps me in life is I don't get bored of having the same breakfast every day, and that just streamlines my experience, at least for the first half of my day. I know I'm going to have energy with something that I don't mind, that it gets me going, allows me to take the day.
That is useful. Just being decisive in general like that, very handy. It saves a lot of time. I have a terrible time with decisions. I always kind of waffle and can't figure things out and take too long.
I mean, waffles for breakfast is fine too. You walked right into that one.
There was a... We have a birthday thing down here with some of my friends, and you know, every year we have a big discussion about what to eat. We all went to college together, and so it was very similar then. And I think this year we spent something like 2 hours trying to figure out where to order pizza and what kind of pizza to get. We could put Congress to shame.
Did it ever break into a fist fight? I've seen some legislators do that.
No, we're all too fat for that.
Did we share that compilation video with you? It's different governments around the world, kind of in their senates and their House of Representatives, just breaking into fistfights, kind of like a hockey game. I'm gonna find this.
I don't think I have seen that, but it sounds very entertaining.
This, I think, is the joy of YouTube. Politicians fighting. Politicians fight compilation. This sounds promising. Oh, and it's got epic music too. Guy goes over to another person. They're both in suits, and they're both grabbing each other's suits and pushing each other and throwing punches. Oh, and here's one, looks like it's Middle Eastern garb, and they're all breaking into a fight, throwing shit. You see, this is the thing that I think unites us, right? Is that we're humans, we're animals, and if we get very upset and we can't use words, then we'll just punch each other.
Well, that's the old school method of settling disputes.
Conflict resolution. Whoever punches the best wins. There you go.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah. Here's the real content we're looking for.
All right, let's see. What was the next one? We had a few more questions. When it comes to space exploration, how are the countries cooperating / competing with each other? Oh, my favorite color is green, for whoever it was that was asking. When it comes to space exploration, how are the countries cooperating / competing with each other? I think in general... Well, let me preface, that's the word I wanted earlier. Let me preface this answer by saying that I'm not a big space exploration guy, and I actually talked about this last week when somebody was asking about the Heavy Falcon launch and its implications. I don't really know. As far as cooperating, competing with each other, I think it depends. In Europe, there's a lot of cooperation. The European Space Agency is basically a pretty strong collective effort, and I think they work relatively closely with NASA. And I think the sort of big example of that is the International Space Station, which is actually surprisingly old. It makes me feel old whenever I hear about it, because that space station was new when I was a kid. So it's very bizarre to hear about them talking about retiring it. But anyway, my age-related anxieties aside, the ESA and NASA, I think, are sort of the preeminent cooperators in space exploration. I think the Japanese also have a space exploration agency, and I think they cooperate as well with the ESA and NASA. But I don't think they really have as much of a budget and don't really do as much. The Chinese, for the most part, kind of go it alone, and they have a very active space program, and they're very ambitious. They're trying to go to the moon, go to Mars, etc. The Russian Space Agency is also still very active, but they're not as ambitious because they kind of have trouble with budget, with funding, basically. I think they did just recently open a new space launch site, because they had been using the old Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. Here's some trivia for you that's kind of relevant to this. When the Soviet Union was building its space program, it launched all of its stuff from a site in Kazakhstan that I think it called the Cosmodrome. And after the Soviet Union collapsed, there was a real question about, all right, well, where's the Russian space program going to launch its rockets from if this site is not in Russia anymore? So what they did is they actually leased not only the space site, the Cosmodrome itself, it actually leased like 100-mile, all of the land within a 100-mile radius of the site. So there's actually a perfectly shaped circle, sort of in the northwest of Kazakhstan, that you can see on maps, and that's this sort of weird leased sovereign Russian zone within Kazakhstan, from which they launched their rockets from, where the Cosmodrome is. It's a leftover from the Soviet period and the Soviet space program. But the Russians didn't want to have to rely on Kazakhstan forever, so they built a new site over in the Russian Far East, which is, I think, not too far from the border from China. I think it's somewhere near the Amur River. If there's any Russians listening, please feel free to correct me on any of this that I'm getting wrong. Participation is encouraged in this regard. But other than that, I think, yeah, the Russian space program is kind of, it's moving along, but it's not doing a whole lot. And I think the United States actually depends on their Soyuz rockets, I think, because the United States doesn't have one right now. Some great planning there. India also has a space program, and they're ambitious, but they don't have a lot of resources to work with. So they're trying to get to Mars, but it's slow going, and they'll probably end up cooperating with some of the other space agencies in that regard, I would assume. But beyond the composition of the different blocks of space agencies, I couldn't really tell you more than that. Couldn't really go much beyond that. As far as competition, I don't think there's really any real competition. Sometimes politicians talk about being the first to go to Mars or competing with such and such other program, but it never really goes anywhere. And I think it's more done for political reasons than it is for any actual enthusiasm to spend a lot of money on space exploration. But it were otherwise. I'd say if there was a competition, it would probably principally be between India and China, because I know they both are trying to go to the moon. So there could be a kind of race to the moon between them. I suspect China will win that, though. I think they're much further ahead than the Indian. So it's not a particularly close competition in that regard. I know the United States said that it wanted to go to Mars or something, but I haven't seen a lot of traction for that. Certainly not a big push to try to beat the Chinese there or anything like that. So I wouldn't even really call that a competition. Yeah, I distinctly remember George W. Bush during his presidency kind of having a non sequitur press conference one day, just declaring that the United States would make a new push to the moon. And I think that was during his second term, and I remember everybody just rolling their eyes, because everybody kind of knew it was just an attempt to try to distract attention from all of the other bullshit that the administration was kind of in trouble for at the time. You know, this was, I think it was after Katrina, the Iraq War was still going on, there was just a lot of problems at the time, and they were in just, their PR was not great. So they tried to kind of improve it by changing the tone of the conversation and changing the conversation itself and trying to, you know, focus attention on space exploration, and we're going to go do this great new thing, and please stop bitching about Iraq. And you know, it did not work at all, and so it never went anywhere, never gained traction, and just kind of disappeared. So I suspect any new effort, a similar such effort announced by the Trump administration, would probably be similar in that regard. Let's see. Have you read any of Yuval Harari's works? Sapiens or Homo Deus? No, I can't say that I have. You know, again, I'm really behind on my fiction reading. But I'll definitely write those down for future reference. Put that on my list of things to read. I have a very long list of things to read, unfortunately. Although I guess in the grand scheme of things, that's the kind of problem you want to have. Let's see, if you are a Star Wars Extended Universe fan, then you will likely remember the Zahn trilogy. Were those your favorites too, and have you heard Zahn is doing a new Star Wars novel? I hadn't heard he was doing a new novel. I think the last thing I remember hearing about, Zahn, not, sorry, I mixed him up with Thrawn. No, I hadn't heard he was doing a new novel, but that sounds pretty cool. I imagine it's probably going to be in the new universe, though, and that kind of tempers my excitement a bit. Also, I just haven't read a Star Wars novel in years. Just haven't been that engaged with the whole universe or the fandom. But I can't say that the Zahn trilogy was my favorite. I actually, my favorite series of books in the extended universe was always the Rogue Squadron series. The X-Wing Rogue Squadron series. I guess it was called the X-Wing series. Yeah, I just really liked, when I was a kid, I really liked fighter planes and sort of the strategy behind, air warfare, basically. So I was particularly attracted and engaged with the X-Wing series. It just kind of hit me at the right time, basically. Just particularly interesting to me at that time. And I just liked the way it was written. Well, most of them anyway.
Ships. Space and ships. Well, I think we'll wrap it up right around here. It's been a nice, we got a little extra 30 minutes on the top for today's session. Thanks for being on, Bud. And FuzzyChord for doing the questions.
Oh, yeah, thanks, Fuzzy.
Follow John Smith on Twitter. Who is it? There's the command, shabam. He's been very active on Twitter, too, so if you want to get some news here and there, follow that. It's nice. It's refreshing given that a lot of people just say random stuff on Twitter, and you're actually putting some substance out there, which is good. Refreshing that Twitter experience. So we should be good for next week as well. We're kind of back in the rhythm now, after I had my holiday time and the winter holidays are past. But great having you on, dude.
Yep. Thanks again.
Kick ass.